Welcome. You've joined us for a fresh deep dive, and today we're stepping into, well, almost an inner sanctum of ancient Egypt.
We're exploring its intellectual heart, you say. And our map, our guide, is this really intriguing catalog of books.
A catalog attributed to Hermes, but recorded for us by Clement of Alexandria.
Exactly. It's not just a dry list, though. Think of it more like gaining entry to a legendary, almost mythical library.
Like, we're curating a kind of mythoacademic salon here today, exploring these, well, strange, sacred, intricate ideas.
Precisely. And Clement sets this incredible scene, doesn't he? This procession of Egyptian priests.
Yeah, each one carrying specific symbols, specific texts related to their role. You see the singer with musical notations, the time watcher with his astronomical tools.
It paints such a vivid picture of structure, of organization. You immediately get a sense of how they viewed knowledge.
It really does. It speaks volumes about their reverence for order and how they saw all this knowledge as, interconnected.
Absolutely. It wasn't just random writings. It was this carefully cultivated body of wisdom, practical and esoteric, side by side.
So our mission today, our deep dive, is really to understand the scope, the nature of these Hermetic books.
And what they might reveal about Egyptian philosophy, their learning, their whole way of thinking.
Okay, so let's start with the foundation. These 42 fundamental treatises. That number itself, 42. It feels significant, doesn't it?
It really does. It resonates, like the 42 negative confessions in the Book of the Dead. It seems to carry weight.
And Clement emphasizes that 36 of these, the non-medical ones, contain the whole philosophy of the Egyptians.
As expressed through their religion, their understanding of the cosmos. It suggests this really holistic system.
Where the spiritual and the intellectual aren't separate things, but just flow together.
Exactly, one single river.
And this whole philosophy is then kind of distributed among these different priestly roles. Let's walk through them, starting with the singer.
Right. The singer carries hymns to the gods, which makes sense.
Standard priestly duty, perhaps.
But also, interestingly, reflections on the king's life.
That's the bit that jumps out. Hymns and royal biography. What does that suggest?
Well, it points towards that powerful link, doesn't it? Between the divine and the pharaoh, the earthly ruler.
So the hymns elevate the gods, and the reflections maybe explore the divine right of kings, how earthly power should mirror heavenly order.
Something like that. It really implies this deep interconnectedness. The temporal world gets its meaning, its legitimacy from the sacred.
Okay. Next up, the Time Watcher. Sounds very evocative.
It does. And this figure is immersed in cosmic rhythms. Carries 4 astrological books.
Well, 4 books detailing what exactly?
The arrangement of the fixed stars, the movements, conjunctions, phases of the sun and moon, the planets.
And the risings of stars, too, it mentioned. So really detailed celestial observation.
Very early, very profound engagement with the heavens, yes. And it probably wasn't just, practical astronomy for calendars.
You mean it was tied into their worldview, astrology as much as astronomy?
Precisely. Decoding patterns, looking for portents in the sky, understanding the cosmic architecture and its influence on Earth.
Fascinating. Then we get the Scribe of the Mysteries. Now that's a title.
It really is. And this category is rich. 10 books.
10. Covering, cosmography, geography, specifically Egypt and the Nile.
Which makes sense, the lifeblood of their civilization.
Also, the constitution of celestial bodies, so more astronomy or maybe cosmology. Temple architecture, land surveying.
And even the specific weights and measures used in sacred rites.
Wow, so this scribe is like a keeper of both sacred secrets and really practical knowledge.
Absolutely embodies that synthesis we talked about. Cosmography maps their conceptual universe, visible and invisible.
While the temple plans and surveying ground it in physical reality.
Exactly, and the weights and measures show the precision they applied even to ritual. Sacred knowledge wasn't just abstract, it was anchored in their world.
Okay, following the scribe is the overseer of the ceremonies.
And their books focus, as you'd expect, on the rituals themselves. Sacrifice, offering first fruits.
Hymns again, maybe different ones from the singers.
Possibly distinct in function, yeah. Also, prayers, processions, feasts, all the detailed practices.
It paints a picture of a very meticulously organized religious life. Like everything had its place, its procedure.
Meticulous choreography is a good way to put it. Each gesture, each event, likely governed by specific protocols, full of symbolic meaning. These books were the script for maintaining cosmic and social harmony.
Then comes the prophet.
Carrying 10 hieratic books. That's the more priestly script, right?
Right, and these deal with laws, the gods themselves, and the entire training regimen for priests.
So the prophet acts as a guardian, holding on to both the spiritual framework and the legal structure of society.
It suggests a pretty hierarchical system, codified knowledge passed down carefully.
Definitely. the importance of tradition, the transmission of knowledge and authority within that priestly class.
And finally, we reach the shrine bearers. Their focus shifts quite dramatically.
It does. To medicine. 6 medical books.
Covering the constitution of the body, diseases, organs, drugs, even specialized areas like eye ailments and women's diseases.
That level of specialization within the priesthood is quite striking, isn't it?
It really is. You don't necessarily think medical expert when you picture an ancient priest.
But it suggests a holistic view of well-being. Physical health probably seen as linked to spiritual purity, divine favor.
It's just such a comprehensive inventory of knowledge covering this incredible spectrum: astronomy, geography, religion, law, medicine.
It truly is.
And this brings us to something really fascinating mentioned in our source material, this overlap with the Making Port Storm excerpt.
Ah yes, the project aiming to organize Clement's own work, the Stromata, using Orphic ideas.
What's stunning is what they found, this very, very interesting degree of overlap between Clement's list of 42 Hermetic books
And the structure of their own project, which also involves, coincidentally or not, 42 books.
and a 42-letter Orphic alphabet, plus other parallels like 6 rolls, 12 symbols, 6 body parts. It's an echo across centuries.
It's a startling convergence, yeah. Clement details this ancient ordered Egyptian system, and then much later, this modern project mapping out Orphic material finds a strikingly similar architecture underneath.
So the big question, is it just coincidence, a pattern we're imposing?
Or does it hint at something deeper, maybe fundamental ways that knowledge gets structured, ways that resonate across time and cultures?
It's a heck of a question. I mean, coincidence is always possible.
Always. But the degree of alignment here, the number 42, the 6 roles Clement mentioned, mirroring the 6 in the Orphic project, it really does make you wonder.
Could there be like archetypal frameworks for how humans categorize knowledge, whether it's Egyptian philosophy or Orphic mysticism?
An inherent tendency, perhaps, to use these kinds of numerical or structural patterns to make sense of vast amounts of information. It's tempting to speculate.
The source also touches briefly on the attribution Thoth for the Egyptians, Hermes for Clement.
Right, the classic syncretism. The Greeks saw their Hermes in the Egyptian Thoth.
God of wisdom, writing, magic. Makes sense.
Yes, a natural parallel. And Clement mentions an Edfu inscription, grounding it back in Egyptian sources and attributing it to this major intellectual figure, Thoth Hermes, the lord of the emanations of Ra.
But we also need to remember why Clement is presenting this list. He has his own agenda, right? He's not just an objective librarian.
Not at all. It's apologetics, really. He's using this incredibly detailed Egyptian system to argue that Greek philosophy wasn't entirely original.
The classic argument that the Greeks borrowed heavily from older cultures, especially Egypt.
Exactly. He specifically flags the idea of the transmigration of the soul as something he thinks the Greeks, appropriated from the Egyptians.
So while this catalog is this invaluable window for us,
we're seeing it through Clement's specific argumentative lens about the origins of Greek thought.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, we're left with this really vivid picture. 42 Hermetic books forming this highly organized, incredibly comprehensive system of knowledge.
Stretching from the stars down to the human body, from sacred rituals to legal codes. A civilization deeply invested in understanding the cosmos and their place in it.
And what seems to echo through time is that human drive to organize, to categorize, to comprehend the sheer vastness of existence.
We see it in this ancient Egyptian library, and maybe, just maybe, we see echoes of it in modern projects trying to chart other complex traditions, like the Orphic one.
Which leads us to a final thought, a question for you listening. Given this ancient library and its diverse subjects and these hints of similar patterns across time,
what hidden connections, what unexpected links might still be lying dormant in our own vast modern archives of knowledge?
What seemingly separate fields might actually share underlying structures or resonate in ways we haven't noticed? What kind of Orphic tasks, you might say, are we unknowingly engaged in today as we try to map our own complex world?
It's definitely something to ponder. Perhaps it might even spark your own deep dive into the connections weaving through it all.
Welcome. So today you've given us this really fascinating collection of sources. It feels like a puzzle box, really. We're going on a deep dive, trying to, feel out the connections between ancient Egypt, Hermetism, and early Gnosticism, specifically Sethianism.
Right. It's like stepping into, as you say, kind of mythoacademic salon.
Yeah.
We're laying out these ideas, these intricate, maybe even slightly unsettling artifacts.
Exactly. And we're aiming to map these overlaps, these hidden pathways.
Precisely. We'll be using Obnoxious, this document, almost like our main guide.
A kind of Rosetta Stone for this specific landscape.
Yeah, something like that. Looking at how it resonates with, lost Hermetic ideas and the beginnings of Sethian thought.
And we're drawing heavily on Grant Adamson's work, the excerpts you provided.
Yes, his work acts as our, let's say, expert map through Obnoxious. It's links to Hermetism, Sethianism, and these other intriguing things like the Salmaskinyaka and deacons.
Okay, so our mission, if you will, is to really understand these intersections. Egyptian thought, Hellenistic philosophy, nascent Gnosticism as seen through Obnoxious and related texts.
That's the goal. Let's start with this idea of a hidden god.
Right. Adamson points out the Egyptian word amu, meaning hidden. Mm-hmm. And fascinatingly, the supreme deity in Obnoxious is described as utterly transcendent, hidden.
Yeah, and you could just say, oh, a coincidence, a linguistic quirk.
But Adamson hints it might be more, doesn't he? Like the first thread in a larger tapestry.
Exactly. It invites us to think about, well, maybe a shared ancestry or parallel development springing from a similar, cultural environment.
A shared imaginative space almost.
Right. And then he points to the theogony in Obnoxious, the origin story of the gods.
He suggests it might echo the Khonsu cosmogony in the number of single and paired gods.
Potentially, yes. That mirroring across different texts is suggestive, isn't it? Like they're drawing from a common symbolic toolkit.
And then the language used in Obnoxious for creation, unbegotten, self-begotten, begotten, that sounds very
Hermetic, yes.
Yeah.
It has that distinct philosophical flavor, a shared vocabulary for these ultimate mysteries.
So Obnoxious isn't just random, it's participating in a specific conversation.
Definitely. And broadening out, the cosmos in Obnoxious seems tied to the Egyptian calendar, specifically the decans.
Those 36 celestial governors of the weeks?
Right. That grounding in Egyptian time and cosmology is really crucial. It anchors the text.
And this is where it gets, strange, right? Adamson notes it seems outside standard Christian or Jewish frameworks.
The 10-day week, marked by decan risings.
Yeah, that's very different from the 7-day week we associate with Abrahamic traditions.
Though he does acknowledge potential Hellenized Jewish influence, maybe like Philo's allegorizers, but
clear Christian fingerprints seem absent, according to some scholars.
Right. The cosmology has these distinctly Egyptian time markers.
Which makes classifying Obnoxious tricky. Why did the Sophia of Jesus Christ authors feel the need to revise it?
Good question. And Adamson points out the lack of a fallen wisdom myth, or a tragedy in the pleroma explaining the visible world.
Yeah.
That makes it hard to just label it Gnostic.
It's in this kind of borderland space, resonating with Gnosticism, but not quite fitting the later mold.
Exactly. It shows how fluid these early movements were.
So the focus shifts back to Egypt and Hermetism. Adamson argues we need to look beyond just the Corpus Hermeticum.
Yes, Clement of Alexandria's mention of those 42 fundamental Egyptian books known by temple staff, that suggests a much richer tradition.
A bigger intellectual landscape than we often assume.
And modern finds, like the Teptunis temple deposit, might actually corroborate this. Hundreds of texts.
Offering glimpses into native priestly knowledge.
Yeah. The relationship between that and Greco-Egyptian Hermetism is still a big question, Even the discourse on the 8th and 9th hints at it, with its mention of an original hieroglyphic text for temple use.
It suggests tangible links between actual Egyptian practice and Hermetic philosophy.
And then there's Iamblichus, his discussion of lost books of Hermes.
In his reply to Porphyry, right? And he believes they were originally Egyptian, then Hellenized.
Which really underscores the Egyptian roots of Hermetism, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Challenges the purely Greek view.
Definitely.
And what's very significant, Adamson highlights the conceptual, even lexical parallels between Obnoxious and Iamblichus's description of Egyptian first principles from those Hermetic books.
That connection seems overlooked, particularly by Iamblichus scholars.
Apparently so. It suggests this deeper shared tradition running underneath.
So not direct copying, but drawing from the same source.
That's Adamson's argument. A shared Greco-Egyptian tradition where old myths were being philosophically reinterpreted. Kind of intellectual ferment.
And we see echoes in the structure. 2 highest gods, consortless.
Right, unbegotten and self-begotten. Then the 4 male-female pairs, the Ogdoad of Hermopolis.
Followed by those cosmological numbers, 12, 72, 360.
Yeah, it's like a common template. And the gods often become quite abstract, sometimes nameless.
And in Obnoxious, that proto-Sathian layer seems to obscure the original identities.
But the 36 deacons, double the 72, they persist, like constellations shining through clouds. Those Egyptian elements are resilient.
Which marks a difference from later Sethianism.
A big difference. This Greco-Egyptian tradition, seen in Obnoxious, seems more positive about creation. Matter isn't from a fall.
Revelation flows continuously from the hidden God outwards.
Exactly. It's a more integrated vision, not one based on cosmic tragedy.
Okay, that sets the stage nicely for digging into the cosmology and calendar in Obnoxious and the deacons and this Salmaskiniaka.
Right, and Adamson frames this using that old debate between Porphyry and Iamblichus.
About whether Egyptians believed in a transcendent God.
Yes. Porphyry was skeptical, pointing to figures like Cherimon in these Salmaskiniaka texts as evidence of a more, naturalistic focus.
He didn't see the abstract interpretations.
But Iamblichus fired back, saying Porphyry was only looking at the surface level, that the books of Hermes contained the real transcendent theology.
So who was Cherimon, and what were the Salmaskiniaka?
Cherimon seems to have been a 1st century CE Egyptian priest who was also versed in Hellenistic philosophy, straddling both worlds.
Okay.
The Salmaskiniaka, though, appear different, likely a source for later Hermetic astrological writings attributed to Nechepso and Pedosiris.
Back in the 2nd century BCE, credited with founding astrology based on Hermes.
That's the tradition. And Hesgistio Thebes connects Nechepso and the Salmaskiniaka to determining decan positions at birth.
And his theory of 7 decanal places affecting life.
Right, it shows the practical astrological application of these ideas.
And the decans themselves, originally markers for the 10-day Egyptian weeks, tied to star risings.
Yes, and Adamson reminds us of their depictions lion-headed gods, serpents in tombs and temples. Powerful symbols.
So the later Greco-Roman synthesis fitting them into the zodiac
was a later systematization. Adamson argues the Salmaskiniaka probably came before that, focusing more on observing the decans of stars based on Hephaestia.
representing an earlier stage of observation.
And the Tibtunus Papyri, the Carlsberg ones, commenting on the older Book of Met.
They show this decanal tracking continuing into the Roman era, even without the zodiac overlay.
Exactly. It shows how deep-rooted the decanal system was in Egypt.
Okay, so with that context, back to Porphyry and Iamblichus. Porphyry described the Salmaskiniaka as containing star names, decans, horoscopes, mighty leaders.
Plus remedies, risings, settings, predictions. But he saw it all naturalistically. No transcendent meaning.
But Iamblichus insisted that was just the lowest level, that the real Hermetic wisdom dealt with deeper principles, distinguishing soul and intellect from nature.
He argued the Salmaskiniaka were just a small part of the picture.
So combining their accounts with Hephaestia gives us a fuller idea. Star names, treatments, movements, prognostication.
Yes, and the Egyptian practice of using decans on amulets, associating them with plants, minerals, astrological medicine, like Nechepso's decan gemstones, it all fits.
A kind of holistic system, astronomy, magic, medicine.
And the decan's significance seems quite old, maybe pre-Ptolemaic, based on things like the naos of the decades.
Adamson also flags Porphyry's terms horoscopes and mighty rulers alongside decans.
And Iamblichus slightly corrects him. It's subtle.
Are there other references to horoscopes distinct from decans?
Limited ones. Adamson mentions Pelon, 98 Asclepius Marsanes. There's a possibility they also numbered 36.
And P. Lond, 98 attests a system of 72 total, 36 decans, 36 horoscopes with Egyptian names.
Yes. It points towards a really complex system we're still piecing together.
Which brings us to Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 465, a fragment that survived.
And it lines up incredibly well with Porphyry and Iamblichus's descriptions of the Salmaskiniaka, a tangible link.
What's key about its structure?
It coordinates Egyptian months with zodiac signs, but then divides things into 72 5-day periods, each ruled by an astral power influencing Earth.
And it has Egyptian elements, gods like Apophis, Typhon.
Yes, kings, temple staff. It's rooted in that context. A blend of Egyptian and Hellenistic thinking.
Dated late 2nd century CE, but could contain older material.
Potentially Ptolemaic, yes. And significantly, it prioritizes the Egyptian 30-day month calendar, even with the zodiac present. unlike later Greco-Roman astrology.
The Egyptian structure remains foundational.
And Adamson argues convincingly that its 72 rulers likely are the 36 decans and 36 horoscopes, even without the labels.
Based on surviving names, iconography like lion heads and serpents, and their influence mirroring Hephaestos' 7 places.
Exactly. It all points back to the decanal system.
And importantly, the predictions aren't based on birth charts, suggesting an earlier astrological form.
Yes, less focused on the natal chart. And the terms mighty one and leader appear, echoing Porphyry and Iamblichus.
So the similarities are strong enough to think P. Oxy, 465 is a fragment of the Celus Geniaca, or very close to it.
That's the argument, but its biggest contribution might be preserving that 72 pentad structure.
Because Iamblichus refers to that structure too, and it underpins Eugnostus.
Precisely. It confirms this framework existed and was significant.
Okay, so now we can tackle Iamblichus's explanation of Egyptian first principles, responding to Porphyry's questions.
Right. Porphyry's probing questions. Is the first cause intellect or beyond? Alone or associated? Corporeal or incorporeal?
The big metaphysical question.
And Iamblichus doesn't give one simple answer. He says different priests had different arrangements. It wasn't monolithic.
His own account is a synthesis, drawing from various sources, including the books of Hermes.
Yes. He starts with 2 incredibly abstract, transcendent deities, nameless, consortless.
The first, unbegotten, is prior to true being, the ultimate one.
And the second, self-begotten, emerges from the one, the first principle of the intelligible realm. Crucially, nothing intelligible touches the ultimate one directly.
It's a strict hierarchy. And what about matter? Porphyry asked if it was begotten or unbegotten.
Iamblichus says God, the self-begetting one, derived matter from essentiality, after separating out materiality.
Okay.
Then the demiurge used this life-filled matter to shape the cosmos.
And this view is fundamentally pro-cosmic.
Yes, Adamson stresses this. Matter isn't a mistake or a fall. It's derived from divine essence by a high God, a positive view of the material world.
Which loops us right back to Eugnostus. Adamson claims a very similar framework exists there.
Suggesting that shared Greco-Egyptian tradition, not direct copying, a convergence of ideas.
The parallels seem quite direct. 2 supreme, consortless gods, unbegotten and self-begetter.
Yes, with similar titles. Fount of all, self-father, beginning of those that come. The resonance is strong.
And Eugnostus describes the self-begetter putting himself forth, a luminous image of the unbegotten.
Just like Iamblichus described the second principle shining forth from the one, a consistent metaphysical picture.
Then the next level in Eugnostus, self-begetter thinks, producing intellect, nupus, with wisdom, Sophia, and truth, Aletheia, as consorts.
And Adamson connects this to Iamblichus's demiurge intellect, the master of truth and wisdom, different renderings of the same principles.
And begetting starts here with further pairs, all gods of creation.
Again, paralleling aspects of the demiurge and his powers in Iamblichus. It's a shared story of emanation.
Adamson also brings in that key Hermetic triad, unbegotten, self-begotten, begotten, citing scholars like Quispel and Mahe,
who even suggest a Hermetic source, like the discourse on the 8th and 9th, influencing Eugnostus. Strong Hermetic currents.
But Eugnostus seems to have fewer begotten gods than expected.
Adamson points this out. Likely the work of that Proto-Seppian redactor, blending different theologies, Genesis, Thebes, Hermopolis. One pair seems lost, titles altered.
It shows the layers of editing.
And the evidence is in those 12 pneumatic powers generated by the Savior and Pistis Sophia. They're said to be modeled on predecessors.
But the numbers don't quite add up in the current text.
Right, there's a discrepancy, an anomaly pointing to changes.
Parrott's reconstruction suggests an original 2 + 8 gods, 4 pairs matching Egyptian models.
Yes, specifically Theban theology and the Hermopolitan Ogdoad. That 2 and 8 structure is seen as distinctly Egyptian.
And it sheds light on the underlying structure before redaction.
It's interesting the Egyptian gods are mostly nameless in Eugnostus, though Amlin might be hinted at in the hiddenness idea.
And unlike Egyptian belief, the Ogdoad are immortalized in a super-celestial realm.
Parrott sees that as a Ptolemaic-era Hellenistic influence.
Yeah.
Mythic history moved to the timeless realm, points of continuity and divergence.
So Adamson keeps returning to Iamblichus's goal, proving Egyptians had transcendent interpretations.
And the parallels with Ignatus' nameless high gods, Ogdoad equivalents support this, plus corroboration from the discourse and the Niles of the decades. It all points to Egyptian roots for Agnostics' cosmology.
Okay, so let's look closer at that cosmology and calendar in Agnostics, the decanal blueprint.
Adamson lays out the structure. 12 powers generate 72, who generate 360. A divine pattern.
Which then manifests physically. 12 eons, each with 6 heavens, each heaven with 5 firmaments, multiplying out.
12 by 6 equals 72 heavens. 72 by 5 equals 360 firmaments. Intricate, hierarchical.
And there's a temporal parallel. Eon matches man, time matches first begetter, year matches savior.
12 months match 12 powers. 360 days match 360 powers. Time and space patterned on the divine, deeply interconnected.
And critically, Agnostics assumes 30-day months, a 360-day year.
Just like Pioxy 465. Which strengthens the idea that the 72 powers in Agnostos are the 36 deacons and 36 horoscopes from the Salmaskiniaka Pioxy 465 system.
The calendrical structures align.
Which makes you wonder about the group behind Agnostos. Calendars are about identity, right?
The Egyptian structure suggests a Hellenized Egyptian author, maybe familiar with Judaism.
Adamson considers a decanal, 10-day week, but acknowledges a 7-day week is possible, maybe from Jewish influence or the later redactor.
But the author doesn't seem focused on the Sabbath or the number 7 like Philo was.
Right. It's ambiguous, potential syncretism in the timekeeping.
But cosmology and calendar aren't the main point of Agnostos.
No, Adamson argues the main goal is showing the visible cosmos is patterned on higher realities. It's arguing against philosophies like Epicureanism or Stoicism, which saw the cosmos as self-governing or ruled by fate.
So it has a polemical edge. But it's also engaging with Hellenistic ideas.
Definitely. The divine pattern idea resonates with Platonism. And the epistemology, the ascent to knowledge, echoes Plato's cave analogy.
So the name Agnostos, the well-knowing one,
suggests someone who's made that ascent, attained gnosis. The text itself invites the reader on that journey, from hidden to revealed.
It's structured as that journey, presenting ideas suited to the reader's current belief, aiming for eventual knowledge.
Yes, a pedagogical aim. And the ending, about the one who need not be taught, revealed within.
That sounds almost mystical, maybe paralleling Hermetic rituals for direct knowledge, like in the discourse.
It's possible. It suggests a link between intellectual learning and spiritual realization. And again, Adamson emphasizes the Greco-Egyptian nature of the gods, echoing Iamblichus's Hermetic sources.
Which brings us finally to the procosmism of Agnostos and how it differs from later Sethianism.
Right, that shared positive view. Matter from divine essence, Iamblichus. Cosmos, patterned on a divine model, Agnostos. Remember that positive valuation.
And crucially, no fallen Sophia myth in Agnostos.
Despite hints of defect elsewhere in Hermetism. Here, the divine pairs act consensually. The chain of being is unbroken. The cosmos is perfect and good.
A fundamentally different starting point than many later Gnostic myths.
And Adamson argues this procosmism is why the authors of the Sophia of Jesus Christ had to revise Agnostos so heavily.
They cut out the detailed cosmology, changed the whole argument, maybe because of different calendar views too.
Likely. A deliberate rejection of that positive cosmic view by later Sethians.
What does this mean for understanding early Sethianism?
Adamson says this shared Greco-Egyptian background means we should reevaluate those elements in Sethianism. They might not always be later additions.
Like potential decanal links for a Yaldabaoth or the 72 demons in the Apocryphon of John connecting to Egyptian deacon lists.
Exactly, or even Hermetic magical practices related to Sethian rituals.
And as Sethianism moved outside Egypt, the cosmology might have shifted. Deacons became less important. Maybe the 7-day week took over.
That seems plausible. Texts like Adversus Heresies or Apocryphon of John show the 7-day week, unlike the likely 10-day week behind Agnostos. Regional adaptations.
So, could the earliest Sethianism have been more pro-cosmic, like Agnostos, without a fallen Sophia?
Adamson floats the Gospel of Judas as a possibility. He has a similar cosmology, a blameless Sophia, but also malevolent archons and a negative view of stars. It's complex.
But maybe Judas represents an earlier stage than the Apocryphon of John, before the Sophia of Jesus Christ authors cut the procosmic parts from Agnostos.
That's a potential timeline. Agnostos potentially quite early, maybe Ptolemaic, given the Pioxy 465 parallels. Then maybe Judas. Then Apocryphon of John, where Sophia does fall.
Right. In Apocryphon of John, the chain of being is broken. Yaldabaoth's creation is inferior, though Adamson notes some inconsistencies suggesting remnants of an older procosmic view even there.
Yes. Both Apocryphon of John and Sophia of Jesus Christ replace procosmism with a stronger dualism.
So the takeaway is, Obnoxious shows this continuous link from hidden God to visible cosmos, a link later broken in Scythianism, but kept longer in Hermetic traditions like Iamblichus's.
Precisely. So, wrapping up, this deep dive has really highlighted the intricate connections, hasn't it, between Egypt, Hermetism, early Scythianism. Ignostus is key to seeing these surprising links.
It definitely offers a richer picture of these ancient currents. And it leaves us and you, the listener, with something to think about, doesn't it? Considering how these groups constructed or dismantled specific cosmologies, what does that tell us?
What does the choice of cosmic architecture reveal about their core understanding of the divine and its relationship to our world?
Yeah. What were the stakes in choosing one cosmic map over another? It really makes you ponder the foundations of these ancient worldviews.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, you've handed us, well, a really compelling puzzle. These fragments attributed to Orpheus. And, forget the lyre for a second. We're diving into the Orpheus that scholars whisper about the supposed master of celestial mechanics and even earthly tremors.
Right. It's quite a different picture.
Imagine.
Yeah.
The mythic poet. His name attached to these proto-scientific attempts to map the stars, decipher earthquakes. It feels like, like finding blueprints from some Mythoacademic Salon.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. Where the mystical and the highly intellectual sort of dance together. A strange ancient jig, as you said.
Exactly.
And for you, I think what's so fascinating here isn't just this sheer range of topics they pin on Orpheus, but the worldview it suggests underneath. These aren't just, poems about the cosmos. They feel like a systematic effort, maybe a bit rough, but an effort to map how the heavens, the earth, and, human life all connect.
Right, like those boundaries were just much more porous back then.
Precisely, much more fluid.
Okay, so our expedition today, really guided by your curiosity, is to trace how Orpheus became this kind of all-knowing sage in the Roman era. We'll sift through these bits and pieces, crediting him with astrology, even physics texts. Then maybe zoom in on one specific poem, this 12-year cycle.
The dodecahedrites, yeah.
And look at other fragments, too, about daily planetary influences, weather, earthquakes.
It's a broad scope.
Think of it as us sort of curating a salon just for you.
Yeah.
Pulling back the curtain on this distant intellectual landscape where, the cosmic and the earthly were just locked together.
And as we, navigate this with our listeners, it's important to remember the Orpheus in these fragments, he's largely a Roman-era construct.
Right, not the original Greek bard.
Exactly. The singer, the charmer of beasts, he evolved centuries later into this figurehead of deep antiquity and hidden wisdom. His name just became this powerful stamp of authority.
Giving legitimacy to all sorts of writing.
Exactly. It really says something about the Roman, maybe, hunger for foundational knowledge, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. Bernabe points this out, right? How Orpheus's name got this huge boost in authority in the Roman period. Suddenly, he's not just singing in the underworld. He's credited with texts way outside his usual mythical sandbox.
Yeah.
We're talking astrology, physics, a whole bunch of fragments, 718 to 803, I think.
That's the range, yes.
And people even tried to bundle them up, call them astrologica, maybe. Though Kruger argued against that, didn't he? Said it wasn't really one single book.
Right. The idea of a unified corpus is debated. But it shows that impulse, doesn't it, to collect and categorize this attributed wisdom.
It does.
And what's really revealing for you, I think, is the picture of Orpheus that comes out of these fragments. Tacitus calls him all-wise.
Right.
Poet, astrologer, philosopher, magician, physician. The whole package. A mythical figure embodying this Roman ideal, just knowing everything.
Like the ultimate polymath.
Exactly. It shows this desire to anchor all knowledge back to some primal, almost divine source. And Orpheus, being so ancient and mysterious, was perfect for that.
Totally. And it wasn't just Tzetzes. There's another fragment, also from Tzetzes, saying Orpheus wrote about nature, stars, magic, all that stuff. It's like the message was, need cosmic secrets, ask Orpheus. And, interestingly, a scholion on Lycophron mentions writing separate from the astrology and magic.
So even more diverse.
The sheer range is just
wow.
Like some legendary ancient hard drive.
And the celestial link is made very explicit. Constantine Lascaris says flat out Orpheus left astrological writings.
Yep.
Then you've got Theon, the philosopher, interpreting the astrology of both Hermes Trismegistus and Orpheus.
Pairing them up, that's significant.
It suggests they saw them as part of the same tradition, this lineage of ancient secret wisdom, like two sides of the same coin, perhaps?
Makes sense. And even the Orphic Argonautica kind of subtly weaves him into this role, right?
Yeah.
Interpreting signs, portents, stars.
Gently retrofitting him, maybe?
Yeah. Aligning him with this later image. And then Julius Firmicus Maternus, when he's writing his big book on astrology, he just lists Orpheus right alongside the big names.
Like Petus Cyrus and Nechepso.
Yeah.
Treats him as totally foundational.
Yeah, just assumes his authority.
And don't forget the Suda, that huge Byzantine encyclopedia. It has an entry for Orpheus and specifically mentions astrological writings.
So the reputation stuck.
Definitely. Roman era and beyond, Orpheus was seen as a major figure for understanding the heavens.
Okay, so we've got Orpheus established as this, like, cosmic authority figure.
Mm-hmm.
Let's dig into what these writings actually said. This 12-year cycle, the dodecarides, that sounds particularly juicy.
It is, and it sparked a lot of scholarly discussion. You know, Lobb, Bohl, Heeg, Kruger, Siegler, van der Weerden, West, Brisson. Lots of attempts to reconstruct it.
So what was it, based on what we know?
Well, Censorinus gives us a description. He talks about this dodecaturus as a 12-year period used in Chaldean astrology.
Chaldean, interesting.
Yeah, and he says it wasn't directly tied to the sun or moon cycles, maybe Jupiter's cycle, but it was linked to earthly things, weather, harvests, diseases, health. It really shows that ancient drive to find these big cycles and connect them right down to human life.
A grand 12-year cosmic forecast, basically, predicting everything from plagues to prosperity.
Pretty much. And the Suda and Constantine Lascaris, they both specifically say Orpheus wrote a dodecaturus.
And they link him to Pisistratus, the tyrant.
They do, which adds this historical layer, though who knows if it's accurate. It sort of grounds the myth a bit, doesn't it? Blurs those lines.
Yeah, it does.
And Sutzes, he really runs with this. He claims Orpheus, being a contemporary of Heracliso, way back.
Deep myth time.
Right. He claims Orpheus wrote both the ephemerides, the daily stuff, and these dodecatorides, long before people like Meton, the historical astronomer.
Wow, quite the claim.
He even says Orpheus wrote about the 12-year cycles and the 19-year lunar cycles before Meton and Ptolemy. It really pushes the idea that all this knowledge was ancient, original to Orpheus.
It certainly makes you think about how they viewed the history of astronomy, or astrology. And Tzitzis also suggests Orpheus advised doing everything mathematically, which Siegler thinks meant astrologically.
Right, it fits the picture. Orpheus seeing the cosmos as this precise blueprint for how to act on Earth.
More than just pretty lights in the sky.
Much more. And we actually have what Setz's claims are the opening lines of the dodecatorides.
Oh, really? What did he say?
They basically say, listen up, keep your minds pure, and hear the divine order revealed from just one night and day.
Evocative. Setting the stage for something big.
It really does. Captures that sense of cosmic interconnectedness from the smallest moment to the grand cycles.
Okay, dramatic opening. Now, the details, this is where it gets fascinating. We have these excerpts, supposedly from the dodecatorides, predicting what happens each year based on which zodiac sign Zeus Jupiter presumably is in.
Yes, very specific predictions. Like when Jupiter's in Aries, the year is meant to be warlike, but also very fruitful. Bad for men, good for animals.
A mixed bag.
Then Taurus is described as Khatum-like, which sounds grim, but fruits apparently do well.
Okay.
Gemini favors only grain. It's dry, seeds suffer, but vines and figs survive. Then Cancer. Cancer sounds pretty bad.
How so?
Animals don't thrive. There's a 5-month winter, misfortunes, plague, animals dying. It even says Cancer swallows the year of Gemini.
Yikes. That paints a vivid picture of how they saw celestial influence really direct, sometimes harsh.
Absolutely. Leo, though, sounds better. Very fruitful early on, lots of wine and oil, wild animals return.
There's always a but, isn't there?
Well, yes, months of strife for people, the olive crop is lost, but figs and wine are okay. So again, a mix.
A real tapestry of bounty and hardship depending on the sign.
Exactly. Virgo is called a year of plague, especially hitting oxen. Distress for humans, not enough fodder for animals, thunderbolts burning seeds, human misfortunes. Seems quite unlucky.
Not a good year to be a farmer or an ox.
Definitely not. Libra, though, brings a resurrection of oxen, animals thrive, lots of leafy growth for people, a welcome change. Scorpio produces grain and oil, but other things struggle. Oak trees bear fruit, though, providing for otherwise barren trees. It highlights how vital even non-standard food sources were.
Right, you look for sustenance wherever you can find it. These details really ground the astrology in agricultural reality.
Let's keep going through the zodiac. Sagittarius starts off warlike, chariots get worn out during harvest, and plague cuts down the abundance. So, conflict and reduced returns.
Not great.
Capricorn is really dramatic. The earth gives wine like water, first fruits are great, a double harvest even.
Sounds amazing.
But don't mix the earth. Thunderbolt mist withers everything. Frost kills the fruit. So, huge potential, huge risk, very volatile.
Wow.
Aquarius comes with a practical warning. Don't sail. The sea is too dangerous then. Simple advice.
Direct astrological navigation advice.
Yep. And finally, Pisces is just said to truly fill all things. More general, but definitely positive.
A good note to end on. It's just incredible how specific these are. War, agriculture, disease, sailing.
It shows how deeply they believed these celestial movements impacted everything. And Tzetzes adds more on Pisces, says Orpheus claimed when Jupiter's there, wine stays pure, strong, fragrant.
Oh.
It's a good time for planting and a good time to get married.
So Pisces was the jackpot sign.
Seems like it. Auspicious all around.
Interesting.
We also get a fragment that's a bit more mysterious, talks about a man ruler, tyrant, king ascending to heaven. The context isn't clear, but it hints at this link between stars and the fate of leaders.
Right, the whole as above, so below idea applied to power.
And mixed in, we find little agricultural snippets that probably fit into this cycle. One about winnowing grain when Golden Demeter judges the wind.
Nice imagery.
Another just says to work the swarms of thick clustering bees. Practical advice, likely timed by the stars.
Connecting the grand cycle to everyday farm tasks.
Then there's a really vivid one. Describes tons of icicles falling from the sky, covering everything. Oaks, mountains, rocks, people shivering inside, can't go out because of the bitter cold and frost.
Wow, you can almost feel that. A year of brutal winter blamed on the cosmos.
Exactly. And following that, another downer. Summer brings a fruitless harvest. Autumn brings no grapes. Just bleak.
A year of famine, essentially.
Seems like it.
Yeah.
And maybe to emphasize the hardship, another tiny fragment just mentions foul and utterly repulsive bugs.
Charming. Adds to the misery, I guess.
So yeah, through these bits and pieces of the dodecaderides, you really get a sense of a world where Jupiter's 12-year journey was thought to orchestrate just about everything.
Yeah, from wars to weddings to wine quality. Okay, that's the big picture cycle. What about the day-to-day, the ephemerides?
Right. Another attributed Orphic poem, this one seems focused on choosing good days and avoiding bad ones based on, well, observations, like a daily astrological guide.
A cosmic day planner.
Pretty much. Proclus mentions it, says these day distinctions were based on observation and there were different systems. Athens had its own. Orpheus apparently had his unique insights. It shows this intense focus on finding order in time down to the individual day.
Trying to find the right time for everything.
Yeah.
Planting, traveling, maybe business deals.
Exactly. And Tzetzes compares Hesiod's advice on days with Orpheus's, saying Orpheus had a different take than Melampus, too. So it sounds like there were competing schools of thought on lucky and unlucky days. Chronomancy, as you put it.
A whole field.
And we see this reflected in later Roman writers. Juvenal makes fun of people obsessively checking their ephemerides before doing anything.
Yeah, I remember that. Can't even leave the house without consulting the stars.
And Ammianus Marcellinus says the same people delaying ordinary stuff until they check the planet positions. It's such a contrast to our clock-dominated lives, isn't it? Where the planets don't consciously factor in most daily decisions.
It really is striking. And Eustathius mentions this too, choosing actions based on stars around Zeus, citing both Orpheus and Hesiod as the go-to guys for days.
The authorities. And we supposedly have the opening line of Orpheus's ephemeries, again via Tzetzes. He tells Musaeus to listen to the order of the month.
Suggests a day-by-day structure.
Exactly, like unfolding the month's cosmic weather day by day.
Do we have details on specific days?
A few. There's a Munich manuscript that lists lucky moon days according to both Hesiod and Orpheus. And it stresses you need to consider moon phases, aspects, other stars. It wasn't simple.
Right, a complex calculation.
Proclus gives an interesting one for the first day of the month according to Orpheus, calls it divine, and gives it the name Monoceros Mostos.
One-horned calf.
Yep. Must have had some specific symbolic meaning in the Orphic system. It reminds you how much symbolic language was woven into their cosmology.
Definitely.
Then Tzetzes gives us a rundown of the first few days. Day 1 linked to Eris Mars, good for strong actions. Day 2 has a two-horned appearance. Day 3 is good for planting. Day 4 has increasing light. It's like a mini almanac.
Building block by block.
We also just hear the 4th day was generally good, and then a more poetic bit about the 6th day, using Homeric language, rosy-fingered, silver-footed dawn.
Blending poetry and astrology again.
Always. The 17th day, Proclus says Orpheus linked it to Ate ruin, but suitable for cutting things, stripping fruit, maybe a day for decisive, destructive type actions.
Channeling that negative energy productively, perhaps.
Maybe. And the 30th day, Tzetzes says Orpheus thought it was bad for everything except lending money, which apparently disagreed with Hesiod.
Good day for bankers, bad for everyone else, according to Orpheus. Shows the different opinion.
It does. And finally, just a basic observation. The waning moon becomes new again, the fundamental cycle underpinning it all. So yeah, the ephemerides offered this daily cosmic guidance system.
Fascinating. Okay, moving on slightly. There are also mentions of agricultural writings linked to Orpheus, Georgics, or Works and Days.
Yes, titles that echo Hesiod, but it looks like these fragments might actually come from someone else, Maximus, from his work on beginnings.
Another case of attribution.
Possibly, or maybe just Orpheus's name being used to give Maximus's work more weight. That happened a lot.
Still, people did attribute them to Orpheus.
Oh yes. Constantine Lascaris mentions Orpheus writing on agriculture. Tzetzes talks about Orpheus's works and days, about farming. The association was definitely there.
Okay.
There's a Scholian with a weird side note about Helen being called Therapanaia in Pleuronia, mentioning Orpheus.
Yeah.
It feels a bit tangential, maybe linked through myth or geography. Ancient texts often layer meanings like that.
Right, not always straightforward.
More relevant, perhaps, are these invocations to the muse attributed to Orpheus calling her Libathrius maiden, Pimplemus maiden, associated with places of inspiration.
Keeping the poetic connection alive even in practical texts.
Exactly. And then a very telling fragment about natal astrology. It says people born when Jupiter's star is rising are destined for royal or leading roles. Unless a malefic star interferes. Classic astrological balancing act. But it shows pure natal astrology embedded right there, supposedly in Orpheus, underscores that belief in celestial destiny. And we have opening lines for this agricultural work too. It invites someone interested in farming to take up the work, guide the plow, tend vines, promising to reveal truths according to the moon cycle and the gifts of Demeter and Bacchus.
Sounds lovely. A call for harmony with nature, guided by the sky gods.
Very much so. Then more specific bits. The moon moving towards Aries, a key marker for timing farm work.
Right.
And a longer piece about Estrella Virgo. Says Virgo is excellent for planting seeds and cuttings, but advises against vines and even mentions myths of Icarius and Dionysus.
Why not vines?
Good question. Maybe because Virgo is linked to Estrella, the virgin goddess of justice who left Earth? Perhaps something about the intoxicating nature of wine or the tragic myths around its discovery didn't fit her sign. It shows this amazing mix of myth, astronomy, and farming advice.
That's really intricate.
And finally, Tzetzes says Orpheus, in his Georgics, judged lunar days as good or bad based on their phase and conjunctions with signs and stars. Again, emphasizing the complexity.
Okay, what about this poem on runaways?
Yes, another brief mention. Attributed to Orpheus, but again, overlaps with Maximus. The fragment we have is, well, evocative but puzzling.
What does it say?
It talks about Iphiclus being incredibly fast, running over grain without breaking it, and about the earth bearing unripe crops on parched fields.
How does that relate to runaways?
It's not immediately clear, is it? Maybe the speed is a metaphor for escape. Maybe the barren fields relate to the disruption caused by someone fleeing. It's one of those fragments that leaves you guessing.
A reminder that we only have tiny pieces of the puzzle sometimes.
Exactly. And finally, perhaps the most dramatic, on earthquakes, Perisismo.
Attributed to Orpheus and Hermes Trismegistus.
Yes, that dual attribution is key. Shows how interchangeable these legendary wisdom figures became, like twin pillars of ancient secret knowledge.
Got it. And the opening.
It grabs you. Urges the child, probably a student, to understand the signs when the dark-haired earthshaker stirs the land, portending good or bad fortune.
Setting the stage for earthquake divination.
Precisely.
Okay.
And then it gets incredibly detailed. Predictions for earthquakes based on the sun's zodiac sign and whether it happens at night or during the day.
Wow. Give me some examples.
Okay. Sun in Aries, night quake means a big uprising in the city. Day quake means evil, ruin, suffering for foreigners, local injuries.
Specific.
Very. Taurus. Night quake rushes forth, but suffering lessens after, peace follows. Day quake brings great wars.
So timing matters hugely, night versus day.
Crucially, Gemini. Night quake means enemies attacking the land. Day quake means kings and leaders become powerless thanks to angry gods. Cancer, especially summer solstice night, signifies heavy evil, poverty. Day quake means harm and uprooting.
Heard you grim stuff.
Often, yes. Leo, night or day. Sorrows, cries, groans, destruction for everyone. Virgo, Procuring, night quake from the west brings plague. Day quake damages crops. Libra, autumnal equinox. Night quake destroys crops. Day quake means harsh battles, many buried. The predictions are often dire, linking quakes to social upheaval, war, famine.
They saw earthquakes not just as natural events, but as major omens.
Absolutely. Scorpio. Night quake brings useless work, bad judgment. Day quake signifies pain from war, wasted efforts, all via Zeus's plans. Sagittarius. Night quake is destructive. Day quake, surprisingly, means honor for a king, but he has to flee his homeland.
A strange mix there.
Capricorn, winter solstice, signifies war, tears, factionalism. Day quake destroys crops. Aquarius, night quake brings ravages, uprooting bad behavior from the people. Day quake sees the people's power become firm.
Interesting political angle there sometimes.
And finally, Pisces. Night quake means siege in all cities. Day quake means sacred ground moves, destruction of herds, oxen, sheep, everything. It's a complete and often terrifying system of astrological seismology.
Astrological seismology.
I thought it.
That's quite a concept. It's just staggering. The level of detail and the conviction behind linking every tremor to a specific celestial configuration and outcome.
It really is. It reveals this intense effort to find order and meaning, even predictability, in one of nature's most frightening and chaotic events.
So summing up, these fragments paint this picture of a Roman-era intellectual world, just fascinated by the cosmos and its power over Earth.
And Orpheus's name, his authority, was absolutely central to legitimizing these astrological and physical ideas.
We've seen it cover huge 12-year cycles for harvests and health, tiny daily influences on decisions, even earthquake predictions based on the sun's sign.
It's a worldview where the sky and the earth, poetry and proto-science were just completely interwoven, a really unique glimpse for us.
Yeah, and what's striking, especially for an audience like ours, interested in both scholarship and art, is that blend. You have this like almost scholarly precision listing signs, outcomes, mixed with really rich, metaphorical, dramatic language.
Absolutely. These texts are fascinating for archivists tracking knowledge history, artists looking for ancient cosmic inspiration, academics studying pre-scientific thought. A real treasure trove.
A very singular mix.
Yeah.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into these strange, sacred, intricate Orphic fragments, let's leave our listeners with a thought to ponder. In our world today, which is so reliant on scientific data, on models that explain earthquakes and weather quite differently, what echoes of this ancient cosmic worldview might still linger, maybe unconsciously, within how we see ourselves, our place in the universe? Are we ever fully free from that very human impulse to find, perhaps, deeper meaning in the stars above or the ground beneath our feet?
Welcome. Today we're plunging into this really fascinating twilight zone of the ancient Greek and Roman world. We're exploring the enigmatic distinction between books that held magic, contained spells, and those that were maybe themselves considered magical.
Right, the book itself having power.
Exactly. Imagine a papyrus thick with whispered incantations versus one that people believed, hummed with its own inherent supernatural energy.
It's a subtle difference, but potentially a huge one.
Yeah. So what does this shadowy boundary, or maybe its absence sometimes, tell us about their profound relationship with the written word and these unseen forces they were dealing with?
Indeed. We're embarking on a delicate excavation of meaning here, aren't we?
Feels like it.
This whole exploration really hinges on a compelling idea from Richard Kiekhaefer. He basically asks, a book with magic is also a magical book.
It sounds plausible, almost intuitive.
It does, at first glance. It possesses a certain intuitive resonance. But as we really immerse ourselves in the textual relics of antiquity, and we're guided here by Jan Bremmer's nuanced study, from books with magic to magical books in ancient Greece and Rome, we start to see something else.
Okay.
We uncover a reality far more intricate, like a tapestry woven with these subtle yet really significant distinctions.
Precisely. So Bremer is kind of our guide, our Virgil, leading us through these literary landscapes of Greece and Rome. And what seems to emerge is this picture of societies where writing and books engaged with religion and this emerging idea of magic in ways that might really challenge our later views, the more scripture-focused ones.
Absolutely. Theirs wasn't quite the religion of the book as we often understand it.
So let's start there, shall we? What actually was the book's place within their sacred practices?
It's really crucial from the outset to recognize that neither Greek nor Roman religion fits neatly into Friedrich Max Müller's concept of a book religion.
Book religion, right.
Yeah, a faith fundamentally anchored in a single sacred text, like the later Abrahamic traditions. They weren't, to use that evocative Islamic phrase, al-Kitab, people of the book.
So their spiritual world wasn't primarily filtered through one big canonical volume?
Exactly not.
Right, because we think of Homer and Hesiod, these massive figures who really shaped the Greek imagination, influenced religious thought profoundly. Their epics had huge cultural, maybe even spiritual weight.
Oh, undeniably. Foundational.
But they weren't scripture in the same way the Torah or the Gospels later became, were they? Authoritative, sure, foundational, like you said, but not with that same kind of unyielding, divinely sealed status.
Precisely. And while that vibrant current of oral tradition flowed so powerfully, especially in the earlier periods, we do start to see the gradual writing down of sacred things.
Okay.
Initially, the book's presence in actual ritual was, quite limited. It mainly showed up in divination, the oracular arts, and maybe some initiation rites, just whispers of the divine caught in script.
Yet it wasn't completely absent, was it? It feels like writing still had a significant role, maybe more on the sidelines, but across a wider range of their religious life, like those curse tablets.
Undeniably. I mean, just think of the sheer number of curse tablets we've actually dug up.
Right.
These fiercely personal, written pleas, often scratched on delay, hurled into, wells or sacred springs, seeking divine intervention, and often pretty nasty intervention at that.
Definitely not friendly requests.
No. And then you have the carefully crafted hymns, the scripts for tragedies that wrestled with deep religious questions, the recorded words from famous oracles like Delphi, Didyma, and Dodona.
Okay.
Even the commentary of Roman priests, their kind of scholarly notes and interpretations of ritual, and the philosophical explorations into divinity by people like Cicero and Seneca, all that relied on the permanence of writing.
So these weren't necessarily magical books themselves, but they show that writing was seen as having some power to interact with the unseen, a sort of precursor.
Exactly. It demonstrates that ancient belief in the written word's power to influence the unseen. Yeah, a precursor to the idea of books holding even more potent, focused magic later on.
Let's dig into divination a bit, as Bremer highlights it. The earliest hint we get is this rather, visceral image. The skin of Epimenides. What's going on there?
Yes, Epimenides. He's a figure sort of shrouded in the mists of the 6th century BC, a miracle worker, a purifier.
Right.
Interestingly, his tomb was actually located within the official precinct of the Spartan ephors, the magistrates. The term skin strongly suggests, a leather sheet, a diphthera, inscribed with oracles.
Leather, like parchment.
Probably, yes. Leather, diphthera was a common writing material then. Using it for oracles here hints at maybe a more ancient, perhaps even more powerful way of recording divine messages compared to papyrus later on.
And this gave the ephors some clout.
It likely afforded them a measure of independent religious authority, separate from the kings who traditionally went to Delphi.
So a portable oracle on animal hide. That really gives you a sense of this primal link to the divine. And then you said there's a shift towards papyrus.
Precisely. Euripides still mentions these older parchment sheets with chanted oracles, evoking a more archaic feel. But by the time of Aristophanes' play Birds, we see an oracle expert just casually saying, take the papyrus sheet, the Biblion.
And he links this to a specific figure.
Yes, crucially, he attributes this practice to Bacchus, a legendary Boeotian seer whose name literally means speaker. It really signals this move from the purely spoken word of prophecy to its material inscription on papyrus.
And this wasn't just a one-off thing. By the mid-5th century BC, we find people like Polymenides leaving their books on divination in their wills. It sounds like a growing trade, or at least a recognized community focused on these collections.
Indeed. Aristophanes' comedies are just full of references to these oracle collections and the people who interpreted them, which shows it was pretty widespread. It's a fascinating peek into how a traditionally oral practice was starting to get written down, organized, and passed around in the tangible form of a book.
Now, another area that might not immediately scream religious, but which Bremer brings into this discussion, is mythography simply writing down myths. How did that connect to the sacred world?
Well, the rise of mythography around 500 BC, with early figures like Akusilaus and Hecataios, was actually quite significant. Initially, it seems its main job was to sort of anchor communities within the larger Greek mythical story by providing a shared ancestry, a sense of collective history, you know, and that gives a kind of cultural and even religious togetherness. These early writers were essentially codifying the foundational myths, moving from just oral telling to a written record, a more stable reference point.
So almost like a community's family tree, but tracing back to heroes and gods, rooting them in that divine past.
In a way, yes, but its function turned out to be surprisingly flexible. By the classical era, mythography was being used to help people understand complex, tragic plays, providing plot summaries, background info, the hypothesis.
Ah, like ancient Cliff's Notes?
Sort of. And then later, in the Hellenistic period, these collections just ballooned into these huge encyclopedias of myth. They became invaluable if you wanted to show off how educated and cultured you were.
Right.
Think of Eratosthenes cataloging the star myths, or Parthenius collecting stories of tragic love, almost like handbooks for the culturally savvy.
So the connection to the sacred shifts, from foundational story to teaching tool, even a mark of social status. That's quite a journey.
It is.
And then we hit Orphism, which seems really unique in how much it used books.
Indeed. Orphism really stands out because of the prominent and maybe slightly puzzling role it gave to Hieroi Logoi.
Holy tales are sacred words. They're sacred books.
Exactly. We know about titles like the Orphic Hymns, accounts of the soul's journey to the underworld, the Catabasis, and various theogonies stories about the birth of the gods.
But even calling them logoi, words, suggests they weren't totally detached from speech.
That's a great point. Even in written form, these Orphic texts probably kept a strong connection to being performed or recited aloud, linking back to that oral tradition.
And how they used these books in rituals was pretty unusual too, wasn't it? Like using a theogony in initiation rites.
Precisely. Demosthenes famously mocked his rival Aeschines for doing just that, reading these books aloud with his mother during initiations. It just highlights how odd this book-focused practice was compared to mainstream Greek religion.
Yet, even with this heavy use of books, Bremer carefully points out they weren't quite holy books in the later sense. They were hieroi logoi, still echoing the spoken word. It brings up that really interesting question Greg Wolf asks. When did Greeks first interact with the book as a primarily religious experience?
It's a tough one, isn't it? The answer probably lies somewhere in that gray area between ritual performance and private reflection. Bremer suggests the Orphic texts might be the closest we get in early Greece.
But maybe still not quite personal devotion.
Probably not in the modern sense. Their main use seems to have been in rituals, or maybe for philosophical discussion, rather than that deep, personal, spiritual reading we might think of today. Wolf suggests Plutarch's on Isis and Osiris could be a later turning point.
And by then, literacy was more common anyway, right? Which changes the whole reader-text relationship.
Exactly. Literacy becoming more widespread is a huge factor in how people relate to written material.
Okay, let's cross the Adriatic now, look at the Etruscans and early Rome. Things look a bit different there regarding books and religion, don't they?
Indeed. Compared to the, let's say, more fluid and less text-based religious scene in Greece, books had a more established, more formal place in Italian religious life. We hear about the Etruscan Libri Fatales and Libri Pontificales books detailing divine law, priestly rules, and of course the famous Roman Sibylline books, full of cryptic prophecies.
But getting your hands on those Roman books was much harder, almost fiercely controlled.
Absolutely. The Roman Senate kept incredibly tight control over these key religious texts. They were kept under lock and key, consulted only in very specific state-sanctioned circumstances.
That's a big contrast with Greece.
A huge contrast to the more open engagement with texts in Greece, even if that was still mostly among the elite there too. And think about statusing. Homer and Hesiod had this kind of canonical authority in Greece, even if not strictly scripture.
Right.
But Virgil's Aeneid in Rome, despite being this massive national epic, never really reached that same level of religious authority.
That's interesting how those foundational stories carried different religious weight. But like in Greece, writing still played a broader, more practical role in Roman religion beyond just the specific sacred book.
Oh, definitely. Writing was essential for just running Roman cults and temples, keeping detailed lists of temple property, drawing up contracts, even personal letters.
And public displays too.
Yes, lots of public inscriptions, calendars showing sacred days, official announcements about festivals, records of bad omens, the prodigy lists, even private promises to the gods. Vows were often written down and put up in temples, making a personal act into a public statement.
But still, no single central holy book emerged.
No. As Bremer emphasizes, despite all this writing in religious context, the Romans never really centered their religion around one single sacred book, like later traditions did. Even the Sibylline books, as Wolff argues, were used more to help interpret rituals correctly, rather than as some kind of complete theological library.
Okay, so the stage is set. Writing and books are definitely woven into Greek and Roman religion, but maybe not in that central scripture-based way we see later. Now let's turn to this really captivating idea, the rise of magic. How did that concept even emerge and evolve back then?
Well, magic, as this distinct category, often with negative connotations, was really a later intellectual development.
This one always there.
No, it gradually started to replace older, more neutral terms for, let's say, non-standard or private religious practices starting around the 5th century BC. Homer, for instance, used words like pharmakon.
Which could mean drug, potion, or charm.
Exactly. And epioide, which just means incantation or chant. The big shift comes with the growing use of the Iranian word magos.
Magos, the root of our word magic. Where do we first see that pop up?
The earliest likely example is in a fragment from the philosopher Heraclitus. He lists this odd group: night wanderers, magi, bacchantes, maenads, initiates.
Magi are in there.
Yes, but here magoi probably doesn't mean magicians as we think of it. It seems to refer to people involved in private, maybe ecstatic cults, like the others listed, likely connected to Dionysus.
Okay, so more descriptive of a group.
And the second oldest mention is in Aeschylus's play The Phocians, where a messenger talks about Magos Arabos, Magos the Arab. Again, it seems like an ethnic or religious label, not yet loaded with the idea of magical practices.
So initially, magos is more like an anthropological term, identifying a specific group or their religion. When does it start to get that shadowy association with what we now call magic?
It's really in the second half of the 5th century BC that we start seeing a clear trend of using magos and related words to describe practices we definitely call magic. But why that shift happened is still debated by scholars.
Bremer talks about a couple of theories, right? Fritz Graff's idea, based on anthropology, about neighbors calling each other magicians, the exotic other.
Yes, Graff suggested looking at it through that Tylorian lens. Maybe the Greeks labeled the Persians, their main other, as magicians, similar to how Scandinavians viewed the Sami people historically.
But it wasn't that simple with the Greeks and Persians.
Well, Graff himself notes it's complex. Yes, the Greeks often set up the Persians as their opposites, but they also admired them in many ways, even adopted some Persian customs. So just a simple us versus them might not capture the full picture of why that word took hold.
And the other theory is linked to the Magi's own rituals, the way they whispered their texts.
Precisely. Bremer suggests that the Magi's habit of reciting their sacred texts, the Avesta and others, in this low, murmuring voice, what Prudentius later called Zoroastrios Susurros, the whispers of Zoroaster probably made their activity seem inherently magical to Greek and Roman listeners.
Because murmuring was linked to spells.
Exactly. Murmuring, that low, indistinct speech, was strongly associated with magical incantations in the Greek and Roman mind. We see this link pop up later in writers from Theocritus and Orpheus to Lucian and Achilles Tatius.
So maybe both things played a part, the otherness and the whispering.
Very likely. Even Graff later conceded that the otherness probably played a role too. So these ideas aren't mutually exclusive, they're likely interwoven threads in how this perception developed.
What about in Rome? Did magus and the idea of magic arrive at the same time as in Greece?
Interestingly, no. Magus seems to come into Latin later. It's not really attested much before Catullus and Cicero, and at first it almost always just meant Persian or Median religious experts.
When does it get linked to things like divination and necromancy in Rome?
That happens more towards the end of the 1st century AD. Writers like Quintilian, Suetonius, Tacitus start using magus and related words in connection with those practices.
Any idea why then?
It might be linked to the rise of the emperors. the huge concentration of power and the resulting anxieties about potential magical threats against the emperor.
Okay, so we have this developing idea of magic and the figure of the magos. Now we get to the core question. Did the ancients see books with magic in them as being themselves magical books? It feels like a subtle but really important difference.
It is indeed, and Bremer carefully shows that evidence for books specifically called out as containing magic actually turns up relatively late. It kind of coincides with magic becoming a clearer category and the book getting more involved in religion generally.
And when these books are mentioned, it's usually bad news for the book.
Almost always negative, yes. They're being targeted for burning, destruction, prohibition, especially in Rome, where religious life was more tightly controlled.
What's the earliest Roman example Bremer gives? Livy during the Second Punic War.
Yes, Livy writes about 213 BC, a very stressful time. The city praetor, M. Attilius, orders people to hand over Libros Vaccinios books with private oracles. It's a bit borderline, isn't it? Between official divination and something seen as potentially illicit.
Right, not explicitly magic books, but maybe heading that way from an official view.
Exactly. And the later example Livy gives, tied to the Bacchanalia scandal in 186 BC, is even more telling. Livy mentions a call for religious texts to be handed over.
But the actual decree.
But the actual Senate decree about the Bacchanalia, the Senatus Consultum Dicalavus, doesn't mention books at all, which suggests maybe specifically magical books weren't really a known category, or at least not a major worry back in the mid-Republic.
And then there's Augustus having that huge bonfire of prophecies in 13 BC, over 2,000 scrolls, Greek and Latin.
Right, but again, Suetonius tells us he kept the official Sibylline books. There's no specific mention that he was demanding books of magic. It seems more about controlling prophecy, reinforcing the state-approved oracles, not hunting down magic texts per se.
This brings us to the word grimoire, the modern term for these books of, well, black magic. Bremer traces its origin back to French grammaire, meaning grammar. That's quite a twist.
It is, isn't it? The term grammaire shows up around 1165 in Le Roman de Tours, meaning a book with magic. Then it shifts over time through grimoire, eventually landing on grimoire.
And the link is maybe just incomprehensibility.
That seems the most likely origin, yeah. Latin grammar was often completely baffling to ordinary people, so written text you couldn't understand could easily seem mysterious, arcane, maybe powerful.
Like the incomprehensible holds power.
Exactly. And it's interesting how late the word really catches on in English, not common until the mid-19th century. It was seen as a foreign term in German too, Zauberbuch.
So if we look for ancient versions of these grimoires, where does Bremer point us? Horace's Epodes.
Yes, the witch Canidia in Horace talks about her Libros Carminum books of spells powerful enough to call down the stars. That's a really strong literary image of a book having real cosmic clout. Likely a papyrus scroll packed with spells.
And that connects to the whole idea of witches drawing down the moon, especially associated with Thessaly.
Right, that was a common belief. We see it mentioned in medical texts like the Hippocratic on the Sacred Disease, and Thessalian women were particularly famous or infamous for this supposed ability. Horace's Libros Carminum probably represent the kind of spell scrolls we start finding more evidence for around his time.
And we do have actual physical examples, like the Philina Papyrus, and that later Hellenistic one with Egyptian spells. These feel like real books with magic that survive.
Absolutely. The Philina Papyrus, as Chris Farroni argues really convincingly, seems to be a collection of Greek spells. Yeah. Some may be going back to much older oral charms, finally written down.
And calling it Thessalian gives it that magical authority.
Precisely. It links it to that known center of magic. The later Hellenistic papyrus is even bolder, claiming it comes from Hermes himself in Heliopolis, Egypt, translated from Egyptian.
Which fits with Egypt's reputation.
Totally. And the fact that Emperor Septimius Severus later confiscated secret books from Egyptian temples shows how seriously that perceived power in texts was taken.
What Pharaoh notes about the Philina Papyrus being organized like a literary anthology is interesting too. Like the scholars in Alexandria collecting poems, someone was collecting spells.
Yes, it suggests that these organized collections of Greek spells probably came about after the main Hellenistic period, using those scholarly methods, which might explain why we don't hear much about Greek or Roman books with magic until around the 1st century BC.
It implies a certain self-consciousness about it being a book.
Right. The act of collecting and organizing implies applying literary or scholarly techniques to magical knowledge.
Okay, shifting to the early Christian era. The Acts of the Apostles gives us the first really clear literary mention of books tied to magic, doesn't it? with the sorcerers in Ephesus burning their scrolls after converting.
Yes, that scene in Acts is really significant. The public burning of these bibloi, these books, by former magic practitioners, is a powerful statement of rejecting those practices.
And Bremer notes there isn't much earlier mention of specifically Jewish books of magic.
Right. He suggests Luke, who wrote Acts, might have been thinking about Jewish exorcism or divination texts that were around in the Second Temple period, like some things found in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Things like exorcistic hymns, the Brontologian, thunder divination, the Slenodromian, moon divination. Those sound pretty potent.
They do. But, as Bremer points out, the community at Qumran, who likely produced them, wouldn't have called them magic. For them, it was part of their religious understanding, given the Old Testament's ban on magic.
So it's that insider-outsider perspective again. What we might label magic, etic, they saw differently.
Exactly. What looks like magic to an outsider would likely fit within their own religious system. But those texts could certainly have circulated more widely in the Jewish diaspora and been seen as magical by others.
And there's that text, Pseudo-Facilities, from the 1st century AD, warning people to keep away from books of magic.
Right.
Which suggests they were around in some Jewish circles then.
Right. It implies their existence and perceived danger.
It's striking, though, how these direct mentions of magic books are still a bit sparse for a while, but when they do pop up, Egypt often seems to be involved. Like that Egyptian priest Pappus in Antonius Diogenes' novel.
Yes, with his satchel of books and his herb chest. He becomes almost a stock figure, the Egyptian magician.
Egypt as the land of magic.
Absolutely. Its reputation for ancient wisdom and secret arts, the ultimate source of magic, really solidifies in this period. Pappus is probably the first literary example of an Egyptian priest as a magician, followed by figures like Thessalus later.
Even Lucian's satire Lover of Lies has that character bragging about his Egyptian magic books and teacher.
Yes, the Pythagorean Arignotus, claiming to be a pupil of Pancrates, whose Egyptian name, Pacrates, actually appears in real magical papyri. And Origen, who knew Egypt well, also mentions books with magic.
But despite these literary references, actual laws specifically against magic books don't really show up until later in the Roman Empire, around the 3rd or 4th century AD.
That's a really key point. Roman legal experts didn't engage much with the religious stuff in their rulings until about the 3rd century. Then, suddenly, in the late 3rd and early 4th century, in legal texts like Paulus's Sententia and parts of Ulpian's Digesta, we see a major change.
What kind of change?
It's not just practicing ars as magic, the art of magic, that's condemned anymore. Now, just possessing books considered to have magic in them is explicitly forbidden.
With serious penalties.
Very serious. Public burning of the books, confiscation of property, even exile or death, depending on your social rank. It's a big step up, condemning not just the act, but the knowledge itself, seeing the book as dangerous.
So the book becomes a vessel of dangerous, contagious power. That's a shift from just banning actions to banning the source material.
Exactly. It shows a growing view of the written word itself as a powerful container for potentially harmful knowledge.
And the 4th century really seems like a prime time for book burnings, Diocletian targeting Egyptian alchemy books.
Yes. Alchemy was often linked with magic. Think about turning lead into gold. Diocletian feared it could fund Egyptian resistance. And we hear about various Christian bishops and others burning books of enchantments. Bishop Paulinus' books, the execution of Lollianus for writing a book on black magic.
And these were often public events?
Often, yes.
Yeah.
Like the magician Cyprian, a sort of prototype for Faust, publicly burning his Goeticus Biblis, his magic books, when he converted. It served as both purification and a stark warning to others.
And this continues into late antiquity. Stories of students hiding magic books, pagan magicians forced to give up their grimoires.
Absolutely. We have accounts like the student John Foulon in Beirut, caught with books full of perverse daimons, which were burned, or the pagan magician in the life of Hypatios, who had to surrender his amulet, book, and magical gear. Even fictional accounts like the burning of the Temple of Marnus in Gaza mention finding books filled with magic inside.
It shows a real ongoing fear of these texts.
Definitely. The fear of this hidden, potentially subversive knowledge contained in books, and the need to physically destroy it, seems quite persistent.
Okay. So we've got this solid evidence for books containing magic, especially from the Christian era onwards. They're often viewed with deep suspicion, often destroyed. But does that automatically mean people thought the books themselves were magical objects?
That is the absolute core of the question, isn't it? And Bremer argues, pretty convincingly I think, that the evidence we've looked at doesn't really support the idea that most people in antiquity saw these books with magic as inherently magical books.
So the container wasn't necessarily magical, just the contents.
That seems to be the dominant view, yes. He then asks, okay, well, did anything in antiquity resemble that idea of an inherently magical book?
And he brings up a potential candidate, though maybe a complicated one, for the Bible in early Christianity. Could it have been seen that way, depending on how you look at it?
It's a really subtle and complex area. First off, the Bible becoming a single book, a codex, was a slow process. It really only picks up steam in the 4th century AD with things like a Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus. These are huge, expensive manuscripts.
Not something everyone had?
Definitely not. Very rare, very costly. But it's possible that just changing the physical form from separate scrolls to one big bound book helped boost its status as a holy book, gave it a kind of singular authority it didn't have before.
But what about Anne-Marie Lugendijk's work, looking at how New Testament fragments were just thrown out with the rubbish in Oxyrhynchus? That suggests maybe people weren't treating the physical book as sacred early on.
Right. Her garbological approach, as she calls it, reveals a surprising amount of casualness in how these early Christian texts were discarded. And Bremer points out that most of her examples where Christian books are treated specially date from the late 4th century or later.
Oh, okay.
There's not much solid evidence from earlier time that the physical Bible was consistently seen as a sacred object.
And the way they were written.
Yeah, the huge number of textual variations, the often quite plain, non-fancy handwriting in early papyri, it suggests that neither the exact wording nor the physical look of the book was hugely important initially.
So the idea of the book having inherent power activated by using it, Martin Wallraff's performative vellons that came later.
That seems to be a later development, yes.
Yeah.
The idea that the Bible wasn't just text, but an object with power you could activate through ritual or just its presence.
But we do see a change in the late 4th century. People like Jerome warning about touching the gospel, not even the whole Bible yet, with unwashed hands.
Yes, definitely a shift.
And Augustine suggesting sleeping with the Gospel of John under your pillow for a fever. That sounds pretty close to using it like a magical charm.
It really does. Those examples, plus finding small gospel books buried in graves from the 4th and 5th centuries onwards, almost certainly as amulets. And we know Jews and Manichaeans around the same time were using miniature holy books, possibly for protection too. It all points to this growing idea that the physical book itself could have some kind of protective or even, well, supernatural power.
It makes you think about how we still invest objects with power, doesn't it?
Absolutely. How belief transforms an object.
And then there are those stories from saints' lives, the Acts of Barnabas, miracles of St. Thecla, life of St. Nicholas of Sion, where the gospel book seems to actively do things, perform miracles.
Exactly. In the Acts of Barnabas, just laying the gospel of Matthew on sick people heals them. In St. Thecla's story, a woman miraculously learns to read the moment she opens a gospel given by God. The book itself seems extraordinary.
And St. Nicholas using the gospel book like a tool alongside the cross to purify a spring or find water.
Right, implying it has this special power. And think about the Council of Ephesus in 431, placing the gospel book on the throne to symbolize Christ being present. These stories, even if not literal history, show a growing belief in the power contained within these specific books.
So looking from the outside, at Dick view, using the gospel like that could definitely seem magical. But as Bremer wraps up, these weren't grimoires, they weren't books made for magic, and most Christians probably didn't think of them as magical objects, even if some church leaders worried about people using them superstitiously, like amulets, Memicthew.
Right, and those specifically Jewish magic books, like the Sofer HaRazim, seem to be too late to really fit into this late antiquity picture we're discussing.
So ultimately, Bremer thinks Kickhafer's statement, "A book with magic is also a magical book," is probably too simple for the ancient world.
Yes, his detailed look suggests it's an oversimplification. That distinction, even if it got blurry sometimes in how people acted or thought, seems to have held some real conceptual weight for them.
Wow. This has been a really illuminating and incredibly rich journey into this ancient world of texts, belief, and how they understood magic. We've traced how writing went from the edges towards the center in religion and navigated that really fine line between books containing magic and the much rarer idea of books being inherently magical themselves.
Indeed. And it leaves us, and maybe you, our listener, with a final, perhaps more evocative question to ponder.
Okay.
Given this slow climb of the written word to a place of such huge cultural, even spiritual power in late antiquity, and how eventually holy scriptures emerged that were seen as having intrinsic power. At what point exactly does a book with magic really shift and become a magical book in people's minds? What's the complex mix of belief, ritual use, and just the changing status of writing itself that makes that transformation happen?
That is a really deep question to think about. We definitely encourage you to explore this fascinating world further. Maybe look into some of the primary sources we mentioned, or hunt down stories about the Anastasi and Nag Hammadi libraries.
There's a whole world of strange, sacred, intricate material out there.
There really is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Welcome, you fellow explorers of veiled histories. You who sense the profound echoes resonating from the half-whispered secrets of antiquity.
Hello there.
Today, we embark on a unique intellectual adventure, tracing the intricate connections between, well, a whole constellation of ancient mystery cults.
Right, we're talking about the enigmatic fellowship of Samothrace, the shadowy Kabiroi,
the ecstatic Corybantes,
and of course the mythical Orpheus. His very name conjures that liminal space between life and death, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And the Orphic Bacchic mysteries that bear his legendary imprint.
Exactly. And we're not just, unearthing dusty relics for some sterile display.
No, absolutely not. Think of us more as curators of a long-forgotten Mythoacademic Salon. We're looking at fragments of belief, of ritual that still shimmer with human yearning.
We want to understand not just what these mysteries were, but what they meant to the people involved. Their hopes, their fears, their connection to the divine.
Their understanding of the cosmos, their visions of the afterlife, all of that.
Precisely. So forget the textbook approach. Our sources: scattered stones, inscribed potsherds, those tantalizing textual fragments, they're like shards of a shattered mirror, really.
Each reflecting a different facet.
Yeah.
It demands a scholar's precision, sure, but also, maybe an artist's eye, discerning patterns in the fragments.
And a poet's sensitivity, maybe, to the symbolic language they used.
And it's in that very act of careful reconstruction, allowing ourselves to be guided by these echoes and whispers, that the real fascination lies.
We're not dealing with fixed dogma here.
No, these were soothed living traditions. It's a delicate dance between analysis and, I suppose, imaginative empathy.
I think that puts it perfectly. Okay, let's begin to unpack this intricate tapestry, starting with the Samothracian mysteries.
Right.
Now, if people are familiar with Eleusis, that sort of grand theater of ancient ritual Samothrace feels different, dimmer, maybe, more provincial perhaps, but just as compelling.
Absolutely. Where Eleusis has this relatively rich inheritance of early accounts, Samothrace mostly reveals itself through, a hazier lens. Hellenistic and Roman periods, mainly.
So, later sources.
Much later, comparatively. Which means we need to be cautious. We have to ground our interpretations in the general logic of Greek religion, but acknowledge the gaps.
The missing pieces.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're piecing together a later performance almost. Maybe one jazzed up by Macedonian or Ptolemaic patronage, like a well-funded revival.
So, less like Eleusis with its single massive annual event drawing pilgrims from everywhere. More continuous, seasonal.
That seems to be the case. Initiation looks possible throughout the sailing season, April to November basically, when the sea, which is so central to Samothrace, was navigable.
Makes sense.
Older accounts might hint at a big festival, but the evidence is elusive. Though there is mention of a panegyris, a kind of fair tied to the mysteries.
So some larger gathering did happen.
Probably, yes. Likely in June. It's interesting to think about Apollonius's Argonauts getting initiated then, also potentially in June. A sort of prestigious window for heroes seeking divine favor.
Timing and prestige, always intertwined in sacred acts. So, how did one actually enter this sacred space? No grand processional way like at Eleusis.
Not that we can definitively say from the archaeology. The sanctuary was near the city. Initiates probably came from the east, passing through a propylon, a formal gateway.
Over the brook.
Yes, spanning the brook that marked the sacred boundary. Like stepping from the ordinary world into something else. There's a whisper about veiling or blindfolding here, but honestly, the evidence is silent.
So maybe a sudden immersion then into the sanctuary's atmosphere, leading to this theatral circle. The name itself suggests performance, not secrecy.
That's a crucial point. This circular paved area with its grandstand, it's one of the oldest parts of the sanctuary, but its very openness makes secret rituals there unlikely.
Like the thronosis, the ritual seating.
Exactly. That theory doesn't really hold up for the circle. Plus, thronosis is more strongly linked to the Corybantes anyway, not Samothrace in the first instance.
Okay, so the circle. Maybe more communal, performative.
Seems likely. A focal point, framed by statue bases, statues and inscriptions long gone, unfortunately. A stage for sacred dramas we can now only guess at.
And the priesthood. Unlike Eleusis' hereditary families.
No evidence for that at Samothrace, no dominant priestly lineage. What's really striking is the survival of the native Thracian language in rituals.
Even centuries later.
Yes, centuries after Greek became dominant. Ceramic inscriptions show Thracian whispers alongside Greek on sacred objects. The ancestral tongue retained its power, it seems.
Fascinating. And preliminary rites, a proclamation, purification.
Likely a public proclamation outside the sanctuary. Then purifications, probably using water from that boundary book. A symbolic washing away of the profane before entering.
Water as that threshold, that purifying element again. Then initiates would proceed to the hall. Sounds important. What went on there?
Primarily animal sacrifices and libations. They found 2 Belthroy pits in the Western Isle. No signs of burning, so probably for blood or liquid offerings. Direct connection to the Clonic powers.
And the sacrifice itself?
The ram seems key. Ram's heads appear on Samothracian coins, connecting strongly to the mysteries. And the sheer number, thousands of conical bowls found everywhere.
Thousands, wow.
Speaks volumes about libations. Initiates probably pour their own offering, a very personal act.
A potent mix, ram sacrifice, and countless individual libations. Now, the core initiation, the transformative bit, where did that happen?
That's still one of the big questions for Samothrace. Several cult buildings' functions might have shifted over time.
But the best candidate?
The Hieron seems most likely. It had benches, like other telesteria or initiation halls, and archaic apse suggests a long history. And there was an ashara, an offering pit, inside.
Right, and this is where Varro comes in, the Roman scholar.
Exactly. Varro, who likely got initiated himself around 67 BC, mentioned 2 bronze statues of naked men. Hands raised, maybe in supplication, maybe revelation, standing before the doors.
Nakedness, raised hands, powerful image.
And it echoes in a later Gnostic text, placing them in the Anactoron, though with a symbolic spin about primal and regenerated man. But the core image seems fixed.
Vulnerability and aspiration. Then the shift type, torches, lamps, and dance.
Yes, the nocturnal entry, lit by flickering flames, must have been dramatic. Dances are mentioned almost certainly ecstatic, like we see in Dionysiac contexts.
Cymbals and tambourines.
Diodorus Siculus links those to the wedding of Cadmos and Harmonia on Samothrace. And the early identification of the Samothracian gods with the Corybantes, famous for ecstatic dances, points that way too.
Cadmos and Harmonia, their story seems woven into the rites. The search for Harmonia, was that acted out? Maybe like Persephone at Eleusis?
Highly probable. The myth of Cadmos abducting Harmonia goes back to the 4th century BC. It provides a strong narrative for a ritual search.
A parallel to Persephone.
The parallels are striking. A yearning for a lost divine figure. Whether the first stage ended with finding Harmonia, like Persephone's return, well, it's a tantalizing possibility.
And the tangible takeaway, the purple fillet, more than just a souvenir.
Absolutely. It was a talisman, especially for sailors. Think of Odysseus and Leucothia's veil in the storm. Protection at sea was a primary goal here.
That really distinguishes it from Eleusis, doesn't it?
Definitely. Even the skeptic Diagoras' quip about shipwreck, initiates missing votives, highlights this maritime focus. It also explains the focus on the Dioscoroi, saviors of sailors, and even dedicating a whole warship in the sanctuary.
A warship? Wow. Okay, so after the main rites, there was a chance to unwind. A panegyris affair?
Yes, Plutarch mentions it. A communal gathering like at Eleusis. A necessary transition maybe, grounding people back in the shared world after the intensity. A communal exhale, as you said.
And then the next level, the apoptia, the seeing beyond. You think it was modeled on Eleusis?
Given the parallels, a Licinian influence seems very likely. The apoptia probably happened sometime after the first initiation. Fewer inscriptions mention apopti than mystae.
Fewer people reach the second level.
Seems so. And those inscriptions near the Hieron saying uninitiated forbidden strongly suggest that building was the venue for this higher revelation.
And the rituals, lustrations, sacrifices, and a scabrous sacred tale. That seems intriguing.
It does, doesn't it? We can assume the usual purifications and offerings, but yes, the sacred story told then is described as scabrous.
What was so scandalous about it?
We have hints. One connects to the origin story, the etiology of those ithyphallic Hermes statues with erect phalluses. Herodotus says the Greeks got this from the Pelasgians, and the Samothracian myth explained it. Callimachus also mentions a mystic tale about Hermes' erection, possibly linking it to the Tercinians or Etruscans.
And the other story.
A more scandalous one about Iasion raping Demeter on Samothrace itself, though that might be a later, more rationalizing myth.
Divine sexuality, raw fertility forces, maybe deliberately challenging for the initiate, and the climax of the apophtia, a great light, like Eleusis.
Exactly. A recently published inscription mentions an initiate seeing the doubly sacred light of Kabiros in the sanctuary, an undeniable echo of Eleusis' finale.
So they emerged as pious apopti.
Yes, identifying as both mestai and pious apopti, and likely concluding with a communal banquet, as was common.
Kabiros. That name brings us to the gods themselves. The gods or great gods seem so anonymous. Why the reluctance to name them?
The anonymity is striking, but not unique. Anonymous gods often preside over foreign, chthonic, or slightly other realms, and the secrecy of the mysteries surely played a part.
Great just means powerful.
Pretty much. It underscores their significance. Interestingly, these anonymous labels pop up more in later Roman sources, maybe fueled by Roman fascination with Samothrace and Aeneas. Outside the island, though, they were just the Samothracian gods.
So insiders were discreet, outsiders needed labels, and the main label they used was the kabiroi.
Yes, as early as the 5th century BC. Herodotus, Decembrotus, they make that connection, and it stuck. The idea of the kabiroi as two males probably fit well with those two statues and the general sense of a divine pair.
Other identifications were attempted too.
Oh yes, links were suggested to the Oi Theoi, the Dactyloi, Corybantes, Coretes, Penates, but solid evidence beyond shared ritual elements is thin.
But we do have some native names, thanks to Menasius of Petara, Axiros, Axiocursa, Axiocursos, Casmilos.
Yes, Menasius identified them with Demeter, Persephone, Hades, and Hermes, drawing clear Eleusinian parallels.
And confirmed by that late curse tablet from Antioch.
Remarkably, yes. It invokes Axiorus Cadmile and Axiorus Cadmilos, a late echo confirming these older names. The author knew about other mystery cults too, suggesting some kind of comparative knowledge was circulating then.
Casmilos being linked to the kabiroi and other sources, it shows how fluid these divine identities could be.
Absolutely. Akusilaus makes Casmilos, the son of Cabero and Hephaestus. It suggests Casmilos might have migrated, mythologically speaking, from the kabiroi sphere to the Samothracian one. They worship kabiroi alongside Casmilios Hermes on Imbros too.
More divine mingling. And Casmilos sounds foreign.
Likely Anatolian origin for the name, adding another layer of syncretism.
So beneath the shifting names, a core structure persists, a triad. One female, two males.
That seems to be the constant. Whether it's Electra and her sons in one myth, or Iasion and his family in another, that structure holds. It suggests a fundamental divine architecture.
The varying names just show the tradition's flexibility.
Especially without fixed iconography. And the later mapping of Eleusinian names onto them shows how influential Eleusis was.
Right, okay. So moving from the relatively serene Samothrace, we plunge into the world of the kabiroi. You called them problematic. Why problematic?
Problematic because the sources are just numerous and confusing, often contradictory. We have to be selective, focus on the key sites. Imbros, Lemnos, parts of the Troad. That's where the ancient Greeks themselves located the heart of the Kabiric cults.
Imbros first. Strong Athenian connection there.
Very strong. Imbros was under Athenian control. And Athenian Ephes, young men doing their military training, actually took an oath as part of initiation into the Kabiric mysteries there.
An oath involving what?
Secrecy, purification, good conduct. Suggests a moral component. And interestingly, an inscription from Imbros includes a goddess among the great gods there, complicating the picture again.
Always a goddess nearby, it seems. And Lemnos, the island of Hephaestus.
He looms large there. The Kabiroi were even called Hephaesti on Lemnos, linking them directly to the smith god and often to the Titans.
Metallurgy.
That connection grows stronger over time, though it's not super early in the evidence. Maybe a local guild of smiths adopted them as patrons. Excavations found a telesterion, an initiation hall, and flute fragments suggest music play a role.
And again, kabiroi plus a female deity.
Yes, on both Imbros and Lemnos. That structure, again, seems very Anatolian in influence.
Okay, from the islands to the mainland. Pergamon and Miletus. Different local flavors.
In Pergamon, the cult had this reputation for being ancient, maybe implying unusual rites. Mysteries happened on the Acropolis during the Kabiria festival, which involved big banquets.
Aethes initiated it there too.
Yes, an honorary decree mentions the Maisis of Ephebes as an ancestral tradition, linked to rites of passage. And the Criobolia, ram sacrifice, was important, again linking the ram to mysteries. It even appeared on coins maybe linked to the Kabiroi.
And geographically close to the Mother Goddess Sanctuary?
Yes, the Kabiroi Sanctuary was near Meter Basileus in Pergamon, a pattern seen elsewhere. Suggests links between these powers.
The ram again. And Miletus, youth, war, puberty rites.
Miletus connects the Kabiroi to two youths, Totus and Anos. Non-Greek names, possibly Ithyphallic imagery, suggests non-Hellenic influence. They were linked to Athena of Asessos, a local deity.
So integrated into local Anatolian cults.
Seems likely. The association with youth and war points strongly towards puberty initiations, maybe with a martial aspect.
And finally, Thebes. Pausanias being tight-lipped in those funny vases.
Pausanias' typical silence on mystery rites definitely adds to the enigma of the Theban Kabirion. And interpreting those often caricatured figures on the vases from mid-5th to 335 BC is a real challenge.
But the sanctuary itself was quite open.
Remarkably so. Slaves, free, men, women, all seem welcome. Lots of beads found suggest a strong female presence, personal offerings, women's names on cantharoi, the drinking cups.
Yeah, also hints of upper-class involvement.
Bull sacrifices, heavy drinking.
Yeah.
It suggests the elite were involved too. A real social mix.
A melting pot. And all those terracotta figurines of boys.
Overwhelming numbers. Boys, youths, kalos graffiti, praising young men. It screams male initiation rites, saying goodbye to childhood. Even finding toys like tops and yo-yos might point to rituals marking that transition.
Which helps interpret that famous Canthoros fragment, Kabiros and Pais.
Exactly. The reclining Kabiros and Pais, his wine pourer, they aren't caricatured like the other figures who are probably worshippers, maybe being gently mocked. It pushes back against reading Orphic anthropogony into it.
Right, focus on the local context. And Kabiros and Pais weren't alone in Thebes. There was a mother figure too.
Pausanias mentions rites for a mother alongside them. So that triad again, 2 males, 1 female.
Echoing Samothrace and the island.
Precisely. And there was a nearby grove for Kare and Demeter Kabiria, plus a myth about Demeter giving sacred objects to Prometheus and Aeneas, who were called Kabiroi.
Bringing in Eleusinian echoes and the Lemnian Smith connection.
Yes, through Aeneas, the man from Etna. Macedonian art shows Kabiroi with hammers, reinforcing that metallurgical link.
So summing up the Kabiroi originating at that Greece-Anatolia interface.
Likely Anatolian roots for the goddess 2 males triad, ancient origins, lots of local variation.
Centrality of puberty rites, maybe specialized on Lemnos with Smiths.
And maybe more orgiastic, drinking, dancing, possibly a bit jollier than Eleusis.
Seems plausible. Okay, so from the often muddled Kabiroi, let's clarify the Corybantes. Often identified with the others, but distinct rituals.
Yes, ancient sources often conflate them, but they had their own ritual fingerprint. Plato gives early hints, but those Erythraean inscriptions about selling priesthoods have really opened things up recently.
So we need to blend literary and epigraphical sources.
Exactly. The inscriptions show public and private aspects. Plato often focuses on the private philosophical angle.
And the name, Corybantes with a Y, is older, hints at Anatolian origin again.
Corybantes does seem older, found in inscriptions and older literature. Cult centers in Rhodes, Kos, Anatolia, spreading later to Ionia, Crete, Athens. Toponyms of the Kirby and southwest Anatolia strongly suggest that origin. Etymology is still unclear, though.
And their nature. Minor gods, profile a bit fuzzy.
Yeah, minor divinities. Pherecydes called them 9 children of Apollo and Rhaetia, often identified with the Curetes known for ecstatic weapon dances, suggesting male ritual. Literature and art often blur the lines.
But the link to madness, altered states, that stands out.
Very much so. Euripides' Hippolytus, Aristophanes' wasps, Plato, they all connect them to frenzy, disturbed states, especially in initiation contexts.
And Plato describes their initiation rites as having 2 parts, preliminaries and the main event.
Yes, a clear structure. The Erythraean inscriptions confirm ablutions, sacrifices. Interestingly, they got energismus in Erythrae offerings, usually for heroes, maybe showing their intermediary status. Ram sacrifice likely part of it too.
What about the crater ritual, the craterismos? Demosthenes described it vividly, more than just drinking.
Demosthenes mentions wearing a fawn skin, Nebrazon, and doing the crater ritual, Kriterazon, along with cleansing. It implies it was significant in Athens too, likely part of the preliminaries.
Not just binge drinking.
Unlikely, especially given women's involvement elsewhere. Probably involved mixing wine or libations in the communal crater for specific ritual purposes, symbolic communion.
And ecstatic dances, krumata with instruments, timpana and kimbala.
Plato mentions those. The handheld drum, the cymbals, paints a picture of wild rhythmic activity, trying to transcend the ordinary through sound and movement.
And thronosis, the ritual seating, attested in Erythrae but not Plato.
Yes, the Erythraean inscriptions mention priests and priestesses being seated ceremonially. Plato doesn't mention it, perhaps because he focused on private experiences, or maybe it was more public or localized ritual.
Finally, the healing aspect, curing phobias or anxiety feelings, as Plato put it, and the link to women.
That's fascinating. Plato's observation, plus the higher number of women in Erythraean inscriptions, his mention of women participants, that votive from a woman in Thessalonica, it all points to a strong connection.
Like the Phrygian mother cult.
Possibly. Maybe these rituals offered middle and upper class women a sanctioned space for emotional release and escape from daily constraints.
Right. From the Corybantes, we turn to Orpheus. The Thracian bard, his voice echoing through so many beliefs, especially the Orphic Bacchic mysteries. His otherness seems key.
Absolutely. Thracian origin, even if later tied to Macedonian Lebethra, marks him as an outsider. Like Dionysus, like Ares, also linked to Thrace. It gives him this aura of ancient, esoteric wisdom.
And his role in the Argonautic expedition. Initiatory undertones there.
You could argue that. The quest itself has initiatory hallmarks, and while early art shows him young, Conan later describes him as a king doing secret rites in a weaponless building, killed by Thracian women.
Linking him to male societies and the invention of mysteries.
Exactly. That tradition makes him a primeval founder of mysteries.
Which leads to the whole debate about Orphism, rationalists versus mystics, and Athens as a key center.
Yes, that debate has been long. But the Dervini Papyrus and literary allusions make Athens undeniable as a hub for Orphic ideas in the 5th century BC. We can identify specific Orphic poems circulating then.
Like the Catabasis, the descent to the underworld. Perhaps the oldest narrative.
Seems likely. His journey to Hades appears to be one of the earliest and most influential Orphic poems in Athens. Even if the full Eurydice story solidifies later, the descent narrative arrives mid-5th century BC. Maybe even Aeschylus alluded to it earlier.
With origins in southern Italy, Pythagorean links, and that idea of afterlife consequences for everyone, not just heroes.
Yes, southern Italy's intellectual ferment, probably Pythagorean circles, seems the source. It democratized the afterlife rewards and punishments for ordinary people based on conduct. A huge shift. Metempsychosis, soul transmigration, also emerges then. Pindar mentions it.
Then the Orphic theogony. Multiple versions probably, but Dervini gives us the oldest glimpse. Again, southern Italy, early 5th century.
Yes, the theogony, likely in various forms. Dervini has quotes and commentary. Its closeness to Parmenides points strongly back to southern Italy, early 5th century. Even later parts, the rapes and so on, seem to have Hellenistic or earlier roots, hinted at by Tatian and Clement, using old Attic forms for Persephone.
What about the Orphic Physica, more philosophical? The soul, pre-Socratic physics, and the Athenian connection via the Tritopators.
The Physica offered an alternative cosmology, blending myth with pre-Socratic ideas about nature and the soul. Immortality, reincarnation were key. The focus on the Tritopatores, those Athenian chthonic figures, suggests an Athenian origin or strong Athenian engagement. The focus on air and the one-many problem points to the later 5th century.
And the hymns, mentioned in Dervini, and that reconstructed hymn about Demeter at Eleusis, showing Orphism engaging with existing cults.
Exactly. Dervini hints at hymns. The reconstructed Demeter hymn blends Orphic ideas with the Homeric hymn, stressing Athens' role in agriculture, referencing figures like Eubulius and Baubo from Athenian cults. Influence of Prodicus suggests mid-late 5th century, probably Athenian or Lusinian origin.
So Orphic texts arrive in Athens after mid-5th century, first imports from Italy, then local compositions, impacting illiterate classes, linking to Eleusis, maybe attracting elite families like the Lycaonids and Eunids. Did this lead to an actual Orphic lifestyle?
It seems so, around the same time. Euripides' Cretan's fragment is the earliest literary picture. Purity, vegetarianism, empsychos implying reincarnation, white clothes avoiding births, deaths,
and archaeological evidence.
A white shroud in an Orphic grave in Thurii backs this up. Strong parallels to Pythagorean life too.
Euripides combining Orpheus with Bacchic revelry and mentioning books. That must have been novel, even suspect in oral Athens. And young Hippolytus suggests Orphism appealed early to the elite youth.
The juxtaposition is intriguing. Orpheus and Dionysiac frenzy, plus books in a religious context relatively new for 5th century Athens. It might have raised eyebrows. And yes, Hippolytus' youthful Orphic piety could suggest early adoption among the elite seeking alternatives.
Spread by wandering initiators or Theotellus, and the connection to women Plato's priestesses, more women in Orphic graves.
The Orphiotelists, charismatic figures with sacred texts, were likely key disseminators. Plato's mention of priestesses in the Meno might hint at female Orphic practitioners. And the prevalence of women in Orphic graves, often with gold leaves, suggests it resonated particularly with them, maybe offering spiritual roles unavailable elsewhere. Parallels to early Christianity are interesting, but Theophrastus saw the Orphiotelist as linked to superstition, so skepticism existed too.
So Orphic ideas challenged Greek norms: asceticism, vegetarianism, isolating from sacrifice, reincarnation, divine election, peddled by initiators to the wealthy, offering knowledge, spells. Which brings us to the Orphic Bacchic Mysteries fusion.
Right. But first, purely Bacchic mysteries. Heraclitus, around 500 BC, warns against night wanderers, Magoi, Bakchoi, Lene, Mistai. That's striking.
His condemnation suggests these private Dionysiac cults were already active, maybe making bold afterlife claims he disliked. And it's the first use of the word mystoria.
Exactly. Private mysteries of Dionysos, Bakchos, and Ephesus. Ecstatic rituals.
And that burial in Olbia, the Black Sea colony. Bronze mirror with UI. Dionysiac names, echoes Heraclitus' targets.
It confirms vibrant Bacchic groups there, men and women around the same time.
Yeah.
That UI cry is pure Maenad ecstasy. Dionysus Uios, ecstatic dancing, chanting.
And the Olbia bone plaques? Life, death life, Dionysus, Orphic. This is the direct link, isn't it? Orphic ideas merging with Dionysiac worship.
Absolutely pivotal. They explicitly link Dionysus with Orphikoi, followers of Orphic ideas, reincarnation, the soul's journey, and the Dionysus involved is likely Dionysus Bacchaeus, the ecstatic one. Remember King Sile's initiation into that very cult in Olbia around then.
So Orphic philosophy meets Dionysiac ecstasy. Literacy suggested by the plaques, maybe higher social status too.
Plausibly, this Orphic Bacchic synthesis was forming by the mid-5th century BC.
Which leads us to the gold leaves, those passports to the underworld, southern Italy again, and early center.
Yes, found mainly in graves there, but also elsewhere. Direct, personal evidence of Orphic Bacchic afterlife beliefs. The Doricisms in the language point strongly to southern Italy. They're guides for the soul.
Passwords, instructions, maps of the afterlife.
Exactly. Passwords like man and child Thyrsos. Instructions to avoid one spring, seek another. The mix of hexameter verse and prose snippets suggests they were recited during initiation rites.
Blurring ritual and knowledge, and that recurring desire to escape the cycle, Kyklos, powerfully shows the reincarnation doctrine embedded in Bacchic practice.
Definitely. The gold leaves explicitly mention escaping the painful cycle. It's core Orphic belief integrated into the mysteries.
And Dionysus Bacchios himself becomes the liberator, as the later leaves from Paulina and Amphipolis state.
Yes, he's explicitly named as the one who released you, firmly linking ecstatic Dionysus to Orphic liberation. And the need for atonement, paying the point or penalty for past wrongs, adds a clear ethical layer to achieving afterlife bliss.
A moral dimension. That Darius painter vase showing Dionysus with Hades and Persephone might even illustrate this liberator role.
It's a compelling possibility, Dionysus interceding, perhaps.
And the emphasis shifts from seeing at Eleusis to hearing and being taught in Orphic Bacchic rites, suggested by Dervini, the gold leaves themselves.
The Dervini commentator stresses hearing. An alternative opening to an Orphic theogony privileges those for whom it is right to hear. It suggests a greater focus on transmitting specific doctrines compared to Eleusis' visual revelations.
Aristophanes linking ignoramus, amethys, with uninitiated amudos fits too. Knowledge is key.
It reinforces that idea. Understanding was part of initiation here.
And Orpheus's connection to elite Athenian families like the Unians. Traces of Orphic theogony in Euripides' Hypsipyle suggests Orphism wasn't just marginal.
It points to Orphism attracting establishment figures too. Maybe private clubs formed, practicing Orphic rites, singing hymns, an exclusive intellectual alternative.
But crucial to remember, Dionysiac mysteries existed without Orphism, right? Euripides' Bacchae shows that pure ecstatic tradition.
Absolutely. The Bacchae depicts powerful Dionysiac rites, seemingly free of Orphic overlays. There was variety.
And the lack of Bacchic mysteries or gold leaves in Attica itself. Eleusis just dominated the Athenian market for afterlife salvation.
Seems likely. Eleusis' prestige and its own compelling promises probably overshadowed competitors in Athens itself.
So we've navigated this intricate, often shadowy landscape. Samothrace, Kaiberoi, Corybantes, Orpheus. Interconnected yet distinct. So much still remains, well, mysterious.
Indeed. especially Orphic Mysteries. Despite all the work, they retain this captivating inscrutability. We see outlines, themes, but the lived experience, that still shimmers just beyond reach.
But even these fragments, these echoes, offer profound insights, don't they? Into that enduring human quest for meaning, community, transcendence.
Precisely. Even incomplete, perplexing, they resonate with fundamental desires.
Yeah.
Understanding our place, connecting with the divine, finding solace, maybe transcendence, in the face of mortality.
And on that note, here's a final thought for you, our fellow explorer of the deep. Given this fascinating, sometimes paradoxical mix of ecstatic experience and complex cosmic stories in these mysteries, what fundamental, maybe timeless human needs do you think they were ultimately trying to meet? And how might those very same needs perhaps still echo today, finding expression maybe in completely different ways within our own complex, often bewildering modern world? Welcome. You've joined us for a deep dive into the really enigmatic currents of Hermetism.
Indeed.
Think of it as an exploration maybe into a kind of hidden archive of thought.
Where Egyptian echoes meet Greek harmonies. It's a fascinating mix.
Exactly. And for you, the listener, the curious mind seeking efficient illumination, well, we aim to chart a course through this pretty intricate intellectual landscape.
Right. Consider this a curated salon of the mind, perhaps. A space where scholarly rigor, dances with imaginative interpretation.
I like that.
We'll be unwrapping the layers of this tradition, starting with the mythical figure at its heart.
Hermes Trismegistus himself.
Right. And the texts that whisper his name. Understanding not just the what, but the resonant why of Hermetism's enduring mystery.
So our journey begins with the icon, Hermes Trismegistus. We'll trace that fascinating confluence. The Greek messenger god merging with his venerable Egyptian counterpart, Thoth.
A powerful fusion.
Then we'll immerse ourselves in the cryptic origins of the Hermetic texts themselves, navigating, the currents of scholarly debate.
Which can get quite heated.
Oh, I bet. Finally, we'll attempt to define this elusive entity we call Hermetism and explore its profound roots in the rich soil of Egyptian religious and cultural life.
So prepare for a fascinating descent.
Absolutely. Let's start right at the heart then. Hermes Trismegistus.
At the very heart, yes. A figure whose identity is less a fixed point and more a shimmering convergence, you could say.
Okay.
Imagine, if you will, the fleet-footed Hermes, son of Zeus and Maya, darting between realms. His caduceus, a symbol of intertwined forces.
The messenger god.
Exactly. Now overlay this with the ancient Egyptian deity Thoth.
Thoth, the ibis-headed god, right?
Yeah.
Keeper of scrolls and secrets. Remind us of his domain again.
Well, Thoth is a figure of profound antiquity. Really ancient. Emerging from the very dawn of Egyptian civilization. You see him in the pyramid texts. He was the architect of writing, the guardian of wisdom, the master of magic. Picture him sometimes that elegant ibis, other times a baboon.
Scribbling the fabric of reality.
Sort of. He was instrumental in their understanding of knowledge, time, the journey to the afterlife. Guiding souls,
So this fusion, it wasn't merely a convenient labeling then.
No, not at all. Something deeper occurred, when these two powerful figures intertwined.
Merging their attributes.
Indeed. This wasn't simple addition. It created a figure embodying both divine communication and profound wisdom. Hermes, the swift intermediary.
Merges with Thoth, the font of all knowledge.
Exactly. This potent syncretism forged an ideal patron for esoteric knowledge, a figure whose very being bridged the earthly and the divine, the Greek intellect and that ancient Egyptian wisdom.
And what about that title Trismegistus? It sounds so grand. Thrice greatest Hermes, what weight does that carry?
Trismegistus really amplifies this sense of profound power and knowledge. Its roots seem to lie in Egyptian ways of emphasizing superlative greatness.
So an Egyptian emphasis originally.
It seems so. While the Greeks acknowledged the merged Thoth Hermes, this specific epithet seems to have crystallized within the Egyptian context first. A testament to the immense wisdom they saw in this figure.
It's intriguing, though. Sometimes Hermes Trismegistus appears almost like a historical sage, a divinely inspired human rather than a god.
Ah, yes.
How do we reconcile those portrayals?
Well, that brings in the concept of euhemerism.
Right, rationalizing myth.
Exactly. Peeling back legend to find a supposed historical kernel. Euhemerism proposed that gods were originally exceptional mortals, kings, heroes, inventors.
Whose deeds led to deification later on.
Precisely. And this idea definitely touched the Hermetica. In some texts, Hermes Trismegistus appears just like that, a primeval lawgiver, a wise king, an inventor elevated to divine status for his contributions.
So the figure himself is a kind of palimpsest. Layers of myth, theology, maybe even historical memory.
Beautifully put. A palimpsest.
Now let's turn to the actual writings, the Hermetic texts. Where do these enigmatic works come from?
Okay, so the core we're dealing with is a collection of Greek treatises attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, naturally,
Circulating where?
within the vibrant intellectual hub of Greco-Roman Egypt. But the question of who really penned these words and what currents shaped them.
That's where the debate starts.
Oh, yes, a fascinating whodunit of the ancient world, really.
The names Reitzenstein and Festuger often come up here, almost like opposing titans. Could you sketch out their arguments?
Indeed. Reitzenstein, he envisioned the philosophical Hermetica as largely the product of Egyptian priests.
Bubbling up from the temples.
That was his idea, a spiritual movement embodying Egyptian religious sensibility, just clothed in Greek philosophical language.
Okay. And Festuger.
Festuger took a different tack.
Yeah.
Well, he granted Egyptian priests their domain in astrology and magic-related fields, he thought, but distinct.
Right.
He argued the philosophical Hermetica were primarily the work of Greek authors.
Greek authors. How did he characterize them?
Rather scathingly, actually. He described them as individuals with philosophical pretensions, but possessing, and this is his phrase, a mediocre culture.
Mediocre culture.
Right.
That's quite blunt. So he saw them as well-intentioned dabblers, not profound thinkers rooted in Egyptian wisdom.
That was the essence of it, yes. Greeks borrowing Egyptian motifs, maybe, but working within a Greek framework and lacking, in his view, real Egyptian depth. Now, the plot thickens considerably with the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library, Codex 6 specifically.
The jars in the desert, containing previously unknown Hermetic treatises.
Exactly, and this happened right when Festuger was writing his major work, La Révélation des Mes Trismegistes.
Perfect timing. Did this dramatic discovery sway his perspective? Did he reconsider the Egyptian roots?
Astonishingly, no. Even when he revised his first volume later, he essentially dismissed the Nag Hammadi finds.
Really? How?
Famously referred to the discovery as just a jar from Egypt. He argued it merely confirmed what the magical papyri already showed, a certain fondness for Hermetic ideas in some scribal circles. He even cited Papyrus Memo as sufficient evidence.
Wow. It suggests a certain inflexibility. Maybe a scholar so invested in his own paradigm.
That new evidence gets filtered through it rather than reshaping it. Precisely. It's quite telling. He seems not to have engaged directly with the Nag Hammadi Hermetica before they were widely available.
Or before his death, even.
Right. One wonders what he would have made of the discourse on the 8th and the 9th from that codex.
Which is now seen as pretty pivotal, isn't it?
Absolutely pivotal for our understanding of Hermetism's multifaceted nature.
This discourse, what makes it such a key, then?
It offers a unique, sometimes different perspective on Hermetic cosmology and salvation compared to the more Hellenized Corpus Hermeticum. It showed greater internal diversity within the tradition, pushing scholars beyond a monolithic view.
Okay. Now, another intriguing thread, the claim within the Hermetica and echoed in the discourse that these books were originally translated from Egyptian into Greek.
Yes, that claim is definitely there.
How much credence do we give that? It's a potent claim anchoring the wisdom firmly in Egypt.
It is potent, but is there tangible evidence of direct translation underlying these Greek texts?
That's the question.
The prevailing scholarly view today, well, it leans against the idea of direct wholesale translation in most cases, but the possibility of Egyptian priests thoroughly versed in Greek philosophy, being involved in the creation of these texts.
And then attributing them strategically to Hermes.
That's a far more compelling scenario. Consider Iamblichus, the later Neoplatonist.
Steeped in ancient wisdom traditions.
Exactly. He clearly had access to Greek literature discussing Egyptian priesthood doctrines. He even cites Manetho and Chaeremon, Egyptian priests who wrote in Greek centuries earlier.
So Iamblichus, this figure invested in ancient wisdom, believed these Hermetic texts had an authentic Egyptian priestly lineage.
It certainly seems so. As Garth Fowden points out, Iamblichus might have been mistaken about them being translated by ancient priests, but his conviction,
And the way he presented the doctrines.
through the figure of a prophetess, yes. It speaks volumes about what felt plausible and authoritative back then. And, as our source notes, there's no definitive reason to just dismiss the idea of Egyptian priests being the wellspring.
Especially if the teachings align with Egyptian theology.
Particularly that of Thebes, yes. The teachings Iamblichus recounts often do.
And Strabo, the geographer, he provides another piece grounding this geographically.
Precisely. Around the turn of the eras, Strabo confirms that Egyptian priests in Thebes were renowned for astronomy and philosophy.
And crucially,
He notes they attributed all such wisdom directly to Hermes. Strong corroborating evidence for that established link between Egyptian priestly authority and Hermes.
this paints a much richer, more interwoven picture than just Greek philosophers musing independently. It suggests a genuine continuity, or at least a perceived one, with ancient Egyptian traditions. Now, the term Hermetism itself seems, well, fluid, applied across very different contexts. How do we anchor our understanding for this deep dive?
That's a critical point. As Kevin Van Bladel has shown, the term has been used pretty broadly, sometimes indiscriminately.
Like with late antique Christian Hermetism.
Exactly. Moraschini uses that for the Church Fathers, engaging with Hermetic literature. And even Renaissance figures like Lazzarelli get called Hermetists.
So it risks becoming almost infinitely elastic, stretching too far.
Precisely. To avoid that conceptual sprawl, we should adopt Van Bladel's more precise definition.
Which is?
Let's consider Hermetism to be the ritual tradition, the specific way of Hermes.
Okay.
Consequently, a Hermetist is someone actively participating in that ritual tradition.
But the adjective Hermetic.
That can be used more broadly for any discourse, any set of ideas, drawing on the myths, teachings, or figure of Hermes.
Ah, that distinction helps. So someone like Iamblichus, using Hermetic texts to validate his theurgy, his ritual techniques.
He'd be participating in Hermetic discourse, yes, even if his primary identity was broader than just Hermetist.
Makes sense.
And Polembia Athanasiadi compellingly suggests Iamblichus might even have been initiated into Hermetism while in Egypt.
Initiation. Do we know for sure?
Definitive proof is elusive, of course, but the possibility highlights the interconnectedness of religious and philosophical currents within what Colin Campbell called the cultic milieu of the era.
This idea of fluid cultic milieu, where ideas and practices just sort of osmose and intertwine, that feels really relevant here.
It does.
Now, let's think about Hermes Trismegistus not just as a figure, but as a potent model author. Why was attributing texts to him so strategically important? What power did that give?
Well, to really grasp Hermes' role as a textual guarantor, we need to appreciate his perceived stature back then.
Okay.
While the philosophical Hermetica are generally dated to the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE,
Right.
the gradual elevation of Thoth to the twice and then thrice greatest, Hermes Trismegistus unfolded over centuries before that.
So by the time these texts emerged,
Hermes Thoth already had this formidable aura of antiquity, wisdom, direct access to the divine.
so putting his name on a text was like giving it instant gravitas, the weight of millennia.
Exactly, a textual strategy of immense power. Imagine claiming your insights came from a sage whose wisdom stretched back to the dawn of time.
A figure revered for understanding cosmic order.
Precisely. Even Herodotus, much earlier, identified Thoth with Hermes, though thrice greatest wasn't common in Greek yet.
And the fact that the epithet itself has Egyptian origins.
Just underscores the deep Egyptian roots of his authority.
This leads us right into exploring those tangible connections between Hermetism and the broader tapestry of Egyptian religion and culture. Even Herodotus, though his portrayal is limited, he offers hints, doesn't he?
He does. While his account of Thoth is brief, he notes the ritual interring of ibises in Hermopolis, connecting the animal to the god, and a temple to Hermes in Bubastis.
Okay. Anything else significant?
Perhaps more significantly, he mentions ritual taboos against wearing wool in Egyptian sanctuaries.
Wool. Why is that important?
He describes these prohibitions as having Orphic and Bacchic parallels, but says their true origin is Egyptian and Pythagorean.
So hinting at a deeper, maybe hidden link between Egyptian practices and later Greek mysteries.
It certainly suggests that, as if these currents of thought flowed beneath the surface, occasionally popping up.
And Pythagoras? He's often linked to arcane knowledge. Is he connected to this Egyptian wellspring too?
Indeed. Later tradition almost universally credits Egypt as the source of Pythagoras' doctrine of metempsychosis, soul transmigration.
Even if the concept wasn't huge in Egypt until later.
Right, and Pythagoras himself was supposedly a reincarnation of Athales.
Son of Hermes, blessed with perfect memory.
Exactly. While it's not explicitly Thoth Hermes, it underscores that growing association of Hermes with profound esoteric knowledge about the soul's nature and destiny.
You mentioned a letter attributed to Menethah, the Egyptian priest historian. That sounds crucial for understanding the mythos around the Egyptian Hermes.
Ah, yes, the Mantha letter. Reportedly, to Ptolemy Philadelphus. It's a truly captivating piece.
Why? What's in it?
Manetho alludes to a hidden stela of Hermes' ancient tablets inscribed with profound wisdom.
Hidden in stele.
Yes, which he claims to have translated in his work, the Book of Sophis. This mention of concealed primordial texts immediately raises questions. Authenticity, purpose.
Hidden stele. It sounds almost like something out of Indiana Jones. Have these things ever been found?
Not in a physical sense that confirms the letter's specific claim, no. The idea of texts hidden for millennia,
Yeah,
it naturally invites skepticism.
understand.
However, even if the hidden stele bit is a literary trope, a symbolic gesture.
It doesn't automatically mean Manetho didn't write the letter.
Exactly. The motif of a learned priest revealing esoteric wisdom to a king was actually a well-established narrative device in Egyptian tradition.
Like in the Westcar Papyrus, or the Setni cycle.
Precisely. Jedi revealing secrets to Khufu, the Book of Thoth found buried. Similar themes appear in the Book of the Dead, the Greek magical papyri, even the famine stela, likely from the early Ptolemaic era.
So, revealing hidden ancient wisdom was a recognized way to lend authority to contemporary claims in Egyptian culture.
Absolutely. It tacked into deep respect for the past and for those who could access its wisdom. And Josephus adds another layer here.
The historian. How?
He says Manetho presented his own history, the Egyptaka, as derived from sacred writings preserved in temples.
Suggesting Manetho's original work might have had an intro like this letter.
Is plausible. Josephus also tells a story about Seth's descendants, inscribing astrological knowledge on stelae that survived the flood,
In the land of Assyria.
which our source argues likely means Egypt, linked to Ceres Sothis. Josephus probably borrowed this flood stele motif from Manetho, adapting it for his own narrative.
It seems like the Hellenistic period was a real crucible of cultural exchange and maybe cultural competition.
Precisely. A kind of cultural one-upmanship, sponsored by the Diadochi, Alexander's successors.
Like Hecataeus writing about Egypt for Ptolemy I.
And Berossus, the Babylonian priest writing for Antiochus I, claiming Babylonian records went back to creation itself.
So Manetho, likely commissioned by Ptolemy II Philadelphus?
Was the Egyptian countermove? Drawing on the authority of Egyptian sacred archives to challenge Berossus? There are even narrative parallels. Berossus' wise fish monster Oannes versus Manetho's two Hermeses, flood myths in both.
And this letter to Philadelphus, it claims to offer knowledge of the future, not just history. That seems odd for a historian.
That's a crucial observation. Some scholars use it to doubt the letter's authenticity, a tension between historian and seer.
Right.
But for an Egyptian priest like Manetho, that rigid distinction likely wouldn't exist in the same way. The purely objective historian was still a pretty new idea even in Greece.
So, as a priest,
Possibly even a high priest of Heliopolis, he'd be involved in rituals believed to affect cosmic order. Priests were seen as having predictive powers. The high priest, Antiar, was called a prophyast in Greek.
and magic, Heka, was part of their toolkit.
Absolutely. Robert Whitner showed magic and religion were intertwined. Priests used Heka in many contexts. So Manetho, offering predictions alongside history, is entirely consistent with his expected role.
Jonathan Z. Smith even called his king list proto-apocalyptic.
Yes, and it shares structures with prophetic demotic texts.
So the king list wasn't just dry names and dates, but potentially held deeper, maybe eschatological significance.
Precisely. And this links to the enigmatic Book of Sothis, Sozolis, the Byzantine chronicler who preserved parts of Manetho.
Right.
He claimed the letter to Philadelphus was a preface to this Book of Sothis, where Manetho supposedly translated those stelae of Hermes.
Which has led to attempts to reconstruct this lost book.
Exactly. By piecing together excerpts in Syncellus' divine king lists, mortal ruler lists, but identifying this reconstruction as the authentic Book of Sothis is highly contested.
It sounds like a tantalizing puzzle with missing pieces. What are the main arguments against this reconstruction being the real deal?
Several good ones. First, Syncellus himself often criticized Manetho's accuracy, so why would he adopt a list wholesale if he thought it came from Manetho?
Good point.
Second, the so-called Maitreya list, the mortal king list part, only once mentions a Gothic cycle, cross-referencing Manetho, suggesting Syncellus didn't equate the two.
Okay.
Crucially, the Maitreya list is missing a 16th dynasty one, definitely in Manetho's known framework via other sources.
Big gap.
Plus, there are significant discrepancies in dating the Exodus and inconsistencies in names and numbering of kings compared to other Manetho summaries and Josephus.
So attempts by people like Lepsius in the 19th century to force it into 30 dynasties?
Relied on pretty strained interpretations, ultimately unsupported.
So, if the reconstructed Book of Sothis is likely a scholarly mirage, what was it?
The more persuasive view is that Book of Sothis was probably just an alternative title for Manetho's main work, the Pitaka.
Maybe a more evocative title.
Possibly. Linked to the Sothic cycle, that hugely important Egyptian astronomical cycle tied to Sirius Sothis.
Which was connected to the Great Year, cosmic catastrophes?
Exactly. Manetho's claim to foretell the future in the letter probably fits here. He might have positioned a new Sothic cycle, starting with Ptolemy III Euergetes as a new golden age.
Making his king list a kind of vaticinium ex eventu, a prophecy after the fact.
Precisely, lending divine foresight to his history. We even have papyrus evidence showing Manetho was important during Euergetes' reign.
Suggesting the Pitaka Book of Sothis was finished then.
Likely completed then, yes. The letter to the long-dead Philadelphus might have been added later, posthumously, to stress the link to his original patron.
This weaving of history, cosmic cycles, prophecy, it really highlights a worldview so different from our often compartmentalized modern view.
Absolutely.
Now, let's shift focus slightly. The intricate relationship between Hermetism, philosophy, and magic. These terms seem to dance around each other.
They certainly do, and it's crucial to see how these categories function and intersect within the Hermetic landscape itself.
What's so?
Both philosophy and magic are used as potent terms of self-identification within Hermetism, and both are often linked to that idealized image of the learned, powerful Egyptian temple priest.
Okay.
We even find early Hermetic astrological treatises, like the Liber Hermetis or De Tridentis Sexdecanis.
Their origins might go back pretty far.
Possibly to the Ptolemaic era, maybe 2nd century BCE, despite some later dating attempts. Franz Cumont, using that earlier date, built a social history connecting these texts directly to the Egyptian priesthood's milieu.
So, from early on, disciplines we might see as distinct astrology, philosophy, maybe early science seem intertwined under this Hermetic banner.
Precisely. And Chaeremon, that Egyptian priest writing in Greek, he claimed Egyptian astrology was this vast, intricate system. Not just planets and zodiac, but Paranetolanta, the 36 decans, horoscopes, the mighty rulers from the Somos Koiniaka, human passions, celestial events, omens.
A comprehensive framework within priestly knowledge.
Absolutely. Iamblichus refers to the Somos Koiniaka too, though he gives it a Neoplatonic spin, unlike Chaeremon's more Stoic take.
And the Iatro Mathematica, the astrological medical text.
Another great example. Attributed to Hermes, it meticulously links human anatomy and ailments to specific zodiac signs and planets within a distinctly Hermetic framework.
It's like the cosmos and the body were seen as intimately connected, governed by the same Hermetic principles. Correspondence, influence.
Exactly that idea.
And Clement of Alexandria's account of the priestly processions. That seems relevant too.
Oh, very relevant. Clement vividly describes priests carrying 36 sacred books of Hermes, one for each decan, plus 6 medical texts.
42 books total.
Corresponding to the 42 nomes of Egypt, and symbolically, Osiris's dismembered limbs. It strongly suggests a defined textual community around the priesthood with authoritative Hermetic literature.
And this division, philosophical versus medicine,
finds an intriguing echo in the Koi Cosmo. A divine prophet receives philosophy for the soul, medicine for the body. And significantly, it also mentions magic's role in nourishing the soul.
So magic wasn't seen as separate or lesser, but integral to this comprehensive Hermetic wisdom that really challenges modern distinctions.
It certainly does.
Now, the Thebes cache, that amazing collection of magical papyri found in Thebes, offers another crucial perspective on Hermetism and magic.
Indeed, though it's important to clarify. Just because Hermes and Thoth are invoked frequently in these papyri
doesn't automatically make the texts Hermetic in that specific tradition-defining sense we talked about?
Exactly. Scholars have offered various views on the relationship between the theoretical Hermetica and these more overtly magical texts.
Like Reitzenstein seeing them as evidence for his Quamandres Gemeinde, a Hermetic community.
Yes, while Festugère, conversely, distinguished between a popular Egyptian Hermetism of the papyri and a savant, intellectual Greek Hermetism in the treatises.
Others suggest borrowing between traditions, or both deriving from Egyptian practices.
Right, with magic being a sort of domestication of temple rituals and Hermetism adapting them to Platonism. It's complex.
It sounds like scholars are still untangling the exact threads. What are some more recent perspectives?
More recently, scholars like Jacob Daleman argue persuasively that the shared milieu behind both the theoretical Hermetica and the practical magical papyri, like the bilingual London Leiden papyrus,
What's what?
was the Egyptian priesthood of the Roman era. He points to shared rhetorical strategies.
Such as?
The priest as miracle worker-wise figure, texts by Thoth Hermes hidden in temples, the royal court as recipient of knowledge. These same devices pop up in the theoretical Hermetica, often just swapping philosophy for magic.
So rather than two separate traditions influencing each other, maybe it's more like different expressions from the same core priestly environment, just with shifts in emphasis.
That's a compelling and increasingly accepted view.
Now, to shed more light on this shared context, the narrative preface to the work of Thessalus of Tralles, a 1st century CE physician.
Yes, that offers particularly valuable insights. Thessalus recounts this transformative, visionary experience he had in Thebes,
Facilitated by
a high-ranking Egyptian priest. Thessalus encounters Asclepius and gets instruction on using astrology for gathering medicinal herbs.
a remarkable account, almost firsthand. Why is it so relevant for the Thebes cache and Hermetism?
Its significance was spotted early by Cumont and Knock, then explored more by Festugière and Jonathan Ziesman.
What key issues does it raise?
Several things that resonate. The centrality of visionary experience for knowledge, the idea of graded knowledge and initiation. Notice the priests were initially reluctant to share with an outsider like Thessalus.
Highlighting the prestige of esoteric knowledge.
Exactly. Also, the complex relationship between native priests and inquisitive foreigners, and the temple's role as a site of knowledge and power.
This idea of secret, tiered knowledge, guarded by priests, that aligns perfectly with the Hermetic emphasis on esoteric wisdom, revealed only to initiates.
Absolutely. It underscores the prestige of that knowledge and reinforces the temple as the place to get it. Which brings us to the visionary practices described in the magical papyri themselves.
Right, the spells.
Detailed spells designed to induce divine appearances, often involving elaborate nighttime rituals.
Could you paint a picture? What might a god's arrival spell involve?
Okay, take one from the Great Paris Magical Papyrus. Meticulous preparation of a phylactery, a specific glazed lamp on a wormwood mat, purification rituals, special attire, maybe prophet's garb, palm fiber sandals.
Wow.
And reciting strings of those nomina barbara, those powerful, seemingly nonsensical words.
Aiming to compel the deity to appear in the lamplight.
Exactly. To make them visible, receptive to questions. Sometimes even more forceful spells of compulsion were included, just in case the deity was reluctant.
Spells of compulsion. That's a rather assertive dynamic with the divine.
It is. It highlights a fascinating, perhaps different approach compared to purely supplicatory worship.
And the expected vision.
Often highly specific. The deity enthroned on a lotus, maybe? And detailed instructions on interacting, even stepping on their toe to stop them leaving before you finished asking questions.
Stepping on a god's toe. Audacious.
Quite. Interestingly, the discourse on the 8th and the 9th from Nag Hammadi shows parallels here too.
How so?
Both in using vowel sequences and nomina barbara for visions, and even its epilogue about erecting a stela, which echoes the instructional ads often found in magical papyri.
So demonstrable overlaps in techniques and desired outcomes between practical magic and theoretical Hermetic texts. Now the Mithras liturgy, that's another text often pulled into this web, isn't it?
It is. Garth Fowden noted its striking resemblance to initiatory aspects in the Hermetica, though he saw magical text as later, maybe diluted.
But Hans Dieter Betz argued differently.
Yes, more recently, Betz argued forcefully that the Mithras liturgy, or ML, actually represents an earlier stage of Hermetism, perhaps 1st or 2nd century CE.
Authored by.
Likely a learned Egyptian priest, immersed in both Egyptian traditions and Hellenistic philosophy.
That would certainly boost the priestly origin hypothesis. Is Betz's view widely accepted now?
Not universally. Some critique his reliance on Stoic concepts for dating, or his assumption of early spiritualization, perhaps downplaying traditional Egyptian elements.
Like John Gee pointing out Egyptian names within the nomina barbara.
Right. Betz might underestimate those. It's crucial to remember the ML, like other divinatory rites, is fundamentally a spell for divine epiphanies.
Meant for a single operator, mainly.
Primarily, yes, though it has instructions for a co-initiate. The ritual involves purification, phylacteries, special ointment.
And the core prayer.
Expresses a profound desire for rebirth as immortal, to achieve ascent, gaining immortal eyes.
Resonating with the eyes of mind in Hermetic texts.
Strongly. though the rebirth in the ML seems temporary, a transformation for the vision, not a permanent state.
So a specific transformative encounter, not enduring apotheosis.
Seems so. There are also instructions for the operator acting as a mistos, an initiator, for the medium, using a mystery ointment on their eyes.
And things like kaifi incense.
Its use in related practices for altering consciousness is noteworthy, as is the emphasis on silent symbol of the living, incorruptible God, often linked to Harpocrates.
The visions describe sound intense.
Extremely vivid, divine fire, unfathomable water, gods gazing, ascent through spheres, encountering stars, a fiery disc opening to reveal closed gates.
And the operator declares,
I am a star that travels with you. A powerful affirmation. Thoth appears, radiating light. There are even parallels with the later Chaldean oracles about the soul's ascent and transformation.
It paints a picture of an intensely personal, transformative ritual, a microcosm of the soul's journey.
Beautifully described.
So, drawing all these diverse threads together, evidence, interpretation. What overarching conclusions can we reach about Hermetism's origins and nature?
Well, based on this intricate tapestry, a compelling case emerges for a significant priestly provenance for Hermetism.
Okay, let's summarize the key points supporting that.
1. Hermes Thoth himself as a potent symbol of priestly scribal identity and authority in Egypt.
Got it.
2. Hermetic myths and narratives often explicitly favor Egyptian temples and priestly wisdom.
Right.
3. Demonstrable evidence of priestly authorship of astrological Hermetica going back possibly to the 2nd century BCE, and this astrology is woven into the broader corpus.
Okay.
4. The magical Hermetica, with clear priestly authorship, 2nd-4th century CE, share significant textual and ritual traditions with the theoretical Hermetica.
Makes sense.
5. Internally, the texts themselves often present their wisdom as coming from ancient Egyptian priestly sources.
The self-representation.
6. Externally, contemporary Greco-Roman sources largely accepted their Hermetica as ancient Egyptian wisdom transmitted via priests.
I never saw it.
And finally, 7. Ample historical evidence shows Egyptian priests actively engaging with the wider Greco-Roman world as respected magicians, astrologers, and spiritual masters.
So it suggests a vibrant, dynamic tradition rooted in the Egyptian priesthood, actively engaging with and adapting to the Hellenistic world, not just appearing out of nowhere.
Precisely. And as we touched on, even idealized priestly portrayals, like in Sherman's Perfect Discourse, offer further intriguing parallels supporting this priestly origin hypothesis.
This has been a truly illuminating deep dive, tracing Hermetism's winding currents, from Hermes Trismegistus through the cryptic texts to its deep connections with Egyptian religion, philosophy, magic.
It's clear it's not a simple linear story.
No, definitely a richly textured, complex tapestry woven from diverse cultural and intellectual threads.
Indeed. And by approaching these texts and related materials, not as isolated ideas floating in a vacuum,
but as intricate cultural artifacts embedded in a specific context, Egyptian priests navigating the Greco-Roman era.
we can begin to truly appreciate the profound layers of meaning and enduring influence within them.
And as we conclude this exploration into Hermetism's heart, a final, maybe evocative question lingers. Given the undeniable, enduring influence of Hermetic ideas across centuries, shaping spiritual, philosophical, even artistic movements, how might a deeper understanding of its original priestly context, its roots in ancient Egypt's sacred soil, fundamentally reshape our appreciation for its remarkable, multifaceted legacy?
It certainly offers much to contemplate.
It does. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Our pleasure.
We invite you all to continue exploring the mysteries we have only just begun to uncover.
Welcome, fellow seekers. Welcome back to our ongoing excavation into the archives of thought.
Glad to be diving in again.
Today, our collective curiosity, the sort of intellectual drive we share, it pulls us toward something particularly shimmering, almost elusive. Orphism in ancient Greece.
Ah, yes. Elusive is definitely the word.
So prepare yourselves. We're not really unearthing a solid statue here, are we? It's more like tracing faint outlines. A vanished fresco, maybe? Debated by scholars for, centuries.
That's a great way to put it. What we have is less a straightforward history and more a delicate piecing together of echoes, sacred echoes. We've gathered these fascinating fragments.
Shards, perhaps?
Exactly, like shards from a shattered vase, meticulously cataloged, excerpts from some really deep scholarly work, sifting through antiquity's whispers about this this enigma.
And what an array of shards. We'll be looking at the Dervini papyrus, that cryptic ink.
And the gold tablets, those weighty little things.
The Orphic rhapsodies, too, the poetic side, even reflections in Plato alongside archaeological bits and pieces, coins.
Right, the mute testimony, as you say.
Our mission, then, is to try and conjure the most compelling essence from all of this. To sketch, maybe, the spectral form of what Orphism might have been.
And respecting the material, of course, it's wonderfully strange stuff. Sacred, intricate.
Absolutely. And we should say up front, defining Orphism. That's been a battleground for scholars.
Oh, definitely. For a big chunk of the 20th century, there was this quite compelling idea of a unified Orphic movement, almost a distinct cult.
You're thinking of Diels, Harrison, Kern. They painted a pretty cohesive picture.
Exactly. And Guthrie, too, he saw it as like a specific color in Greek religion, rooted in texts.
But then the path seemed to split, didn't it? As often happens.
Right, you had figures like Linforth raising serious doubts. Was this unified picture just a scholarly mirage?
Dodds was skeptical too, I remember. Saw it as maybe a fragile construct, relying too much on later stuff.
But then came the Dervini papyrus in the 60s. That just sent ripples through everything. It kind of Rosetta Stone for this field.
Because it was so early, relatively speaking, 4th century BC. But the idea is maybe even older.
Precisely. It reignited the whole debate. So, more recent approaches. They tend to look for Orphism in the literature, the stuff attributed to Orpheus.
And maybe a distinct religious feel, a certain sensibility.
Yes, exactly. Like group seeing a core doctrine in the cosmogonies, or West focusing on the Orphic poems. Older ink talked about an Orphic theology, this sort of mood, maybe a yearning for salvation through knowledge.
Okay, so let's tackle that first big challenge, definition. Our source material points out, rightly I think, that a really clear, unambiguous picture just doesn't emerge easily.
No, it really doesn't. It's not like defining Platonism or Stoicism where you have, clearer tenets.
So how do we approach it? I know Edmonds had an idea.
Right, Edmonds proposed what he called a polythetic definition. It's quite elegant, actually.
Polythetic meaning?
Meaning something might get labeled Orphic if it claimed, say, extraordinary purity, or a special divine connection, or maybe extreme antiquity that gave it authority.
Or even just being strange, uncanny.
Exactly, that palpable sense of the other.
That casts a pretty wide net, though. Doesn't Edmonds himself say that could maybe include figures like Empedocles? Or the Sibylline oracles?
He does. It suggests this pervasive sense of something set apart, clinging to certain ideas or practices. It's less about strict boundaries, more about family resemblances, perhaps.
Okay. And the approach of our source material here, how are we looking at it?
Well, it's focusing on literary analysis of those key texts, Dervini papyrus, gold tablets, bone tablets, the rhapsodies.
Alongside other contemporary evidence, inscriptions, coins.
Right. And crucially, it's setting aside later sources, things like the Orphic hymns or the Argonautica. The idea is to focus on that earlier period, maybe 6th to 3rd century BC.
Getting closer to the origins. Makes sense.
So before diving into those core texts, maybe we should look at how Orphism was in by outsiders, people not necessarily in the group.
Good idea. What impression did it make on the wider world? Let's start with the big one, Plato.
Okay, Plato. In his dialogues, you get these really intriguing glimpses, almost like reflections in polished bronze, as you said.
Again, the cradles.
Exactly. Socrates attributes this idea, the body, summa, being the tomb, sima, of the soul. He attributes it to those affiliated to Orpheus, hoi Amphiorphia.
Body as tomb. Wow. That implies the soul is imprisoned, right? Doing time for some past mistake.
That's the strong implication. Imprisoned until a penalty is paid. It paints this picture of duality, body versus soul, and maybe hints at a better afterlife, a release.
A release from the sepulcher of the body, powerful stuff. It suggests this life isn't the ideal state.
Definitely not. It's a state of privation, inferior to what might come next. Then look at the Protagoras.
What does Protagoras say?
He links Orpheus and Musaeus too, and their sex, with mystic rites, teletai, and soothsaying.
So again, a distinct group tied to Orpheus, involved in specific religious, slightly esoteric practices.
And the consistency is interesting. Plato uses that same phrase, hoi Amphiorphia, in both dialogues. It suggests a recognizable group in his day.
More than just poets, then. A religious function, tied to initiation, perhaps.
Seems likely. Now, moving beyond Plato, there's the play Rhesus, often attributed to Euripides, though that's debated.
What does Rhesus add?
While the muse herself says Persephone, queen of the underworld, is obligated to free Rhesus's soul because he was a friend of Orpheus.
Ah, so that echoes the Cratylus idea of liberation. But why is Persephone obligated?
The play suggests Orpheus revealed secretive mysteries, and maybe that knowledge, that revelation, is the key to Persephone's obligation.
As if Orpheus held some kind of cosmic key.
Possibly, and Rhesus's fate isn't just release, he becomes a man-god, revered by those with understanding.
A man-god, that's quite something for that period. Even Eleusis didn't promise actual deification, did it?
Not explicitly like that, no. It highlights the secrecy again, too. Were these mysteries just incredibly sacred or maybe dangerous knowledge for the uninitiated?
Let's bring in Aristotle, Plato's student. What did he make of it all in De Anima?
Aristotle mentions the so-called Orphic poems.
The piece?
A PC.
Okay, poems. What do they say?
They claimed the soul enters the body from the universe through breathing, carried on the winds.
An interesting theory. Did Aristotle buy it?
Not really. He criticizes it, points out it doesn't work for plants or some animals, his usual logical approach.
But what's key is that he mentions multiple poems, apisi, but attributes one theory, one logos to them about the soul's entry.
Exactly. It suggests a collection of texts, maybe poetry and explanation with this specific doctrine about the soul.
And like Plato, he's focused on the soul's nature and origin. That theme keeps coming up. The soul as maybe a fragment of the cosmos, predating the body.
That seems to be a core idea perceived by outsiders. Now let's look at Herodotus.
The father of history. What did he notice?
He's talking about burial customs, and he links practices called Orphic and Bacchic. Notice the pairing again.
Orphic and Bacchic, right.
Links them with Egyptian and Pythagorean customs, specifically not being buried in woolen garments.
That specific detail again. Why no wool?
He mentions a sacred story, a hieros logos, associated with the rite. But typically Herodotus, he doesn't tell us the story.
The secrecy element once more. But the connection to Bacchic rites and Pythagoras is significant.
Very. And the hieros logos idea reinforces that Orphic practices often have these narrative mythic foundations explaining the why of the ritual.
Let's jump forward to Plutarch, writing later, but looking back.
Plutarch gives us some great connections. He mentions the birth of Phanes from the cosmic egg,
which is central to the Orphic Rhapsodies. Right?
Absolutely. And Plutarch interprets this theogony as a hieros logos, a sacred story told during mysteries to a select, pure audience. Echoes of the Dervini papyrus there.
So he's bridging the non-Orphic mentions with the core Orphic texts themselves. What about the egg connection he makes?
Right. He notes the Orphic Pythagorean reluctance to eat eggs. He links it directly to the myth of Phanes hatching from the egg, and even to offering eggs in Dionysian rites.
It shows how myth, ritual, even diet could be all interwoven. Belief really permeating daily life?
Exactly. So if we draw these non-Orphic threads together, what picture emerges?
Well, several things seem consistent. Association with sacred stories, written or maybe oral.
Definitely. And secrecy. A strong sense of needing to keep things hidden.
The connection, or at least overlap, with Pythagorean ideas keeps popping up.
It does. And finally, this deep concern with eschatology, the soul's fate after death, and broader metaphysical questions about the soul and the cosmos.
That seems to be the core of how Orphism was seen from the outside. Which brings us neatly to the texts themselves. You mentioned scrolls, not modern books. Were they actually used in rituals?
That's the key question, and the attitudes towards them seem mixed. Look at Plato again in the Republic.
What does he say there?
Adeimantus talks, pretty scornfully, about a babble of books. Biblin de Homedon.
A babble. Sounds suspicious.
Very. Books attributed to Orpheus and Musaeus, used during sacrifices. They supposedly offered atonement, purification for this life and the next. He calls the practices teletai, initiations.
So, books used in rituals promising salvation, but Plato, or Adeimantus, clearly looks down on it. Excessive, maybe even fraudulent.
That's the implication. And he connects these texts to Orpheus and Musaeus, suggesting a known body of literature. Plato seems very wary of these initiators using texts to sell salvation.
Our source also mentions these wandering priests and prophets.
Right. Figures who use various texts, not just Orphic ones apparently. Plato calls them beggar prophets, agitridic kaimantes. Again, very critical.
And these figures sound a bit like the Orpheo Teleste. even if Plato doesn't use the term.
They do seem similar, offering purification, talking about the afterlife, using Orpheus's name or texts for authority, almost religious entrepreneurs.
But we shouldn't equate these maybe marginal figures with all of Orphism.
No, that's a crucial distinction the source makes. Then we get Theophrastus, Aristotle's student. He actually uses the term Orphiotelestos.
In his characters, the superstitious man.
Exactly, the Deicidaemon. This character goes monthly to the Orphiotelestai to be inducted, telesthesamenos, often with his whole family.
Okay, Theophrastus is probably satirizing the excess, the monthly visits. But it implies these priests existed and performed rites for a broader audience, men, women, children.
It suggests it was a more established, recognizable thing in late 4th century Athens, even if Theophrastus found the superstition amusing. They were part of the religious landscape.
Plutarch also mentions an Orphiotelestes, doesn't he, Philip?
Yes, the poor initiator promising a happy afterlife. Leotychidus' sarcastic comment about Philip's own poverty highlights the contrast, and again, that focus on the afterlife.
Then there's Euripides' Hippolytos, Theseus' accusations.
Right. Theseus basically calls Hippolytos Orphic because he's vegetarian, hangs around with Orpheus's ideas, does Bacchic stuff, Bacchia, using many writings, grammata, and bangs on about purity.
That's a fascinating cluster of traits. Vegetarianism, Bacchic rites, writings, purity.
And the explicit mention of grammata, writings, is key. And its plural, polygrammata, many writings, suggests a body of texts.
Even though Theseus is wrong about Hippolytos in the play.
Exactly. Hippolytos is actually pure. But the fact Euripides uses this collection of traits to label someone, Orphic suggests the concept of an Orphic life, the Orphikos bios, was recognizable in the 5th century BC. Maybe controversial.
And Artemis promising Hippolytos rewards in the afterlife. There's that eschatology again.
It's always there. So we have these bibloi scrolls used in rituals, sometimes scorned, sometimes maybe accepted. How does that relate to the hieroi logoi, the sacred stories?
Is there a difference in how they were viewed?
It seems so. The hieroi logoi were these core sacred narratives, often explaining origins etiological, like Herodotus' story about the wool ban, or Plutarch's about the cosmic egg.
And the attitude towards those was more respectful, reverent even.
Yes, often emphasizing secrecy, restricted access. Contrast that with the scorn Plato and Euripides heap on the public use of bibloi.
So maybe a hierarchy. The foundational stories held more prestige than the books used in perhaps more commercial rites.
That seems plausible. Look at Demosthenes describing rites using books. It sounds very different from the secrecy around the hieroi logoi in Herodotus or Plutarch.
Could it be that the hieroi logoi were originally oral, and writing them down was seen suspiciously?
That's a strong possibility. Codifying something meant to be secret, maybe passed orally through initiation, could have felt like desacralization, making public what should be private.
We even have that later account from Athenagoras about Diagoras of Melos getting in trouble for revealing the Orphic doctrine, the Orphicon Logon.
Right. It shows the enduring idea of sacredness and secrecy. Bremer even suggested later Orphic poems might have adopted the title Hieros Logos to borrow that authority.
And Plato in the Laws mentions a story told in Teletai about afterlife punishments, possibly in Orphic Hieros Logos itself.
Very possibly. Linking back again to the body as tomb idea from the Cratylus, and his epistles mention ancient and sacred stories about the soul's immortality and judgment. Sounds very much like the kind of thing associated with the Orphikos bios.
So this complex relationship between oral tradition, revered stories, and written texts. Orphism seems to have used both with varying reactions. Let's shift focus now. Where did all this happen? Geographically.
Okay, geography. Mainland Greece has some key spots, though often relying on later sources like Pausanias. Direct early evidence can be thin, maybe because of the secrecy?
Possibly. What about Phleia in Attica?
Interesting place. Hippolytus of Rome claimed Orphic rites there predated Eleusis, mentioned an inscribed portico with the legomena, the spoken parts.
Pausanias backs that up slightly.
He mentions the Lycomedae family there, priests chanting Orphic hymns to love and Demeter. And a torchbearer, the Dedushos like at Eleusis, maybe rivalry.
Plutarch confirms the sanctuary existed, restored by Themistocles, and maybe dedicated to Kore Protagon.
That's a possibility. Kore Protagon is key in the Rhapsodies and Dervini. An inscription found there links Demeter and Kore Protagon. It points strongly to Orphic influence in Phleia.
What about Hermione in the Argolis?
Strong links to Demeter Chthoniia, the underworld goddess. Pausanias and Euripides Heracles connect it to a catabasis ritual, a descent to the underworld.
Which fits the Orphic focus on the afterlife.
Exactly, and they worshipped an unusual triad, Demeter, Clymenos, that's Hades and Kor, possibly reflected in poetry by Lassos of Hermione, hints of Orphic ideas there too.
Any other mainland spots? Aegina, Sparta.
Pausanias links Orpheus to establishing mystic rites for Hecate on Aegina, Hecate being Shinnick, connected to magic and the dead. That fits plausibly, given Persephone's importance.
And Sparta.
Pausanias credits Orpheus with starting the cult of Chorus Sotera, Savior Kore, there.
Okay, mainland Greece has these pockets. But the big finds, the really concrete stuff, came from Macedonia, didn't they?
Absolutely. The Derveni papyrus, the gold tablets, undeniable primary evidence of Orphic presence there.
And non-Orphic sources link Macedonia too.
Yes, Euripides and Alcestis might hint at tablets set down by Orpheus's voice in nearby Thrace linked to a Dionysiac oracle.
Herodotus mentioned a Dionysiac oracle in Thrace too.
Right. And later commentaries, Scholia, explicitly connect that oracle on Mount Haemus or Pangaean to Orpheus's writings or tablets. The Rhesus author also mentions an oracle on Pangaean and Persephone's debt to Orpheus's friends.
It keeps circling back. Pausanias talks about an oracle given to the Lyabethrans from a Thracian Dionysiac oracle connected to Orpheus's bones.
And Philostratus puts an oracle on Lesbos, speaking from Orpheus's head, its pronouncements reaching Babylon, shows his perceived authority.
Plutarch's story about the sweating statue of Orpheus at Walbethra before Alexander's campaigns.
Another link. Plus, all the myths about Orpheus's death and burial in Macedonia, or Thrace Ovid, Eratosthenes, Plato, Demagidas, all place him there. Suggests activity.
Even Dio Chrysostom's legend about Macedonians descending from animals charmed by Orpheus.
It's fanciful, yes, but used to explain the Alexandrians' love of song, maybe hinting at ecstatic rites and soul doctrines connected to Orpheus in that region.
Macedonia leads naturally to Thrace and Phrygia, often linked, and Thrace is Orpheus's mythical home, right? Son of Calliope and Oeagrus.
Exactly, and Euripides' Baccha connects Dionysiac revels with purity, initiated souls, Rhea, and Phrygia, all potentially resonating with Orphic ideas.
Diodorus Siculus puts Orpheus alongside the mysteries of the Caecones in Thrace, comparing them to Eleusis and Samothrace.
Plutarch links Orpheus and Phrygia through ideas about demigods and shared mourning rites. He also mentions reincarnation of unlawful soul as smoke, maybe hinting at the Orphic myth of humans from Titan ashes.
There's that historical link too. Herodotus says the Brydes, who became the Phrygians, came from Macedonia, Thrace. Archaeology supports movement. Could explain transmission.
And myths connect Orpheus to King Midas in Phrygia Orpheus, showing him Bacchic rites. Midas with donkey ears on pots, it all weaves together.
Finally, Asia Minor.
Cyzicus.
Yes, Cyzicus, a Milesian colony with the cult of Kor Sotera, Savior Kor. Remember her from Sparta.
I do.
Coins from Cyzicus show Dionysos sometimes young, sometimes as a winged serpent from a Sista, plus Eros, a Maenad Pan.
Sounds potentially like the myth of Persephone Kor and the infant Dionysus, protected by serpents. It certainly resonates. And the title, Sotera, Savior, points to eschatology, fitting Orphism. Kor Sotera, linked to Orpheus by Pausanias in Sparta, worshipped here with these Dionysiac Orphic symbols. It's compelling.
So across this huge area, we see Orpheus linked to rituals, specific gods Demeter, Kore, Dionysus, Hecate, and this constant undertone about the soul and the afterlife.
Which brings us back full circle to the writings. We know Orpheus had canonical status, right? Alongside Homer, Hesiod, Musaeus.
Yes, sources from the 5th, 4th century BC confirm that. Hippias via Clement, Plato's Apology, and Ion, Alexis's Linus. People knew works attributed to him.
And these works were likely religious in content, based on everything we've discussed. Isocrates even says Orpheus wrote preposterous tales about the gods, which got him killed, suggests challenging traditional myth.
Athenagoras credits him with inventing gods' names and genealogies, making him a foundational religious authority, though Edmonds nuanced that view for the classical period.
The Pimerian marble, that 3rd century BC inscription, mentions an Orpheus poem about Persephone's rape and Demeter's search. Links him to mythology, maybe even Eleusis.
Clement quotes an Orphic poem related to Eleusis, calling Orpheus the Mystigogos, the initiator.
And Plato in the Republic mentions a song by Musaeus' son, Eumolpus, about afterlife blessings for the pious, suggests a teaching role may be used in mystery initiations. Parker saw Orphic poems as heroi logoi for Eleusis.
So, a recognized body of work by Orpheus and those near him, covering myth, theogony, eschatology, maybe even influencing mainstream mysteries.
It seems plausible. Our source distinguishes between unspecified works like Aristotle mentioning Orphic poems on the soul, Pausanias mentioning hymns, and those with titles listed much later in the Suda Encyclopedia.
What kind of titles appear in the Suda?
A real mix. Astronomical, divinatory, ritual religious, mythological, theogonical, philosophical, ethical, magical, curative, musical. Varies category, too.
Wow, specific examples.
Things like Dodecaterides on the 12-year cycle, Charismoi oracles, and tellingly, Harai Logoi, sacred discourses.
So those categories in the Suda really just reflect the incredibly varied picture of Orpheus and Orphic practices we've been tracing all along from the earlier authors.
Exactly. Orpheus as innovator, poet, ritualist, diviner, even proto-scientist.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we're left not with one neat definition of Orphism, are we?
No, definitely not. It's far more complex, multifaceted. We've traced these recurring threads, sacred stories, secret rites, powerful beliefs about the soul's journey, all clinging to this authoritative figure of Orpheus.
It really is a rich tapestry. Threads weaving through different places, different times in ancient Greece, hinting at this vibrant, influential, but ultimately quite elusive current flowing beneath the surface.
It is indeed. And it leaves us, as these explorations often do, with a final thought, a question maybe to ponder. While given this fascinating, sometimes bewildering mixed myth, ritual, philosophy, even hints of early science all tangled up in what we call Orphism, how might that make us reconsider the boundaries we tend to draw between religion, philosophy, science, myth? And when we try to understand the ancient world, are categories perhaps too rigid for their reality?